At the cafe, my friends had challenged me to talk to the next guy who walked in, but when he did, I almost backed out immediately. Tall, dark, and way too handsome, he looked like he could own the entire street. My friends nudged me, whispering, "Now or never," and though my brain screamed at me to stay put, I took a deep breath and approached him. "Hey, I noticed you seem as confused about coffee orders as I am," I said, hoping I didn't sound as nervous as I felt. He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made me feel both relieved and flustered. "Guilty as charged," he replied. "I can never decide if I want coffee or a milkshake in disguise." We laughed, and just like that, it was as if we were old friends catching up. We both ended up ordering ridiculous fraps that were more dessert than drink and sat down at a corner table. We started chatting about the simple stuff, favorite coffee spots, guilty pleasure TV shows, and terrible movie sequels. He was so easy to talk to that I nearly forgot I was technically flirting. But then he leaned forward, his tone shifting. "So, how often do you approach random guys in cafes?" Caught off guard, I stammered, "Well, not often." "Okay, this is a total dare." He laughed, a sound so full and genuine it made me smile despite my embarrassment. "Lucky for me, then," he said, holding up his glass. "To unexpected dares." We toasted with our cold drinks, and I felt this electric warmth between us. But the real surprise came when he started sharing about his life. He was from out of town, visiting on business, and we got into this deep conversation about the differences between city life and the quiet, sleepy town he came from. As he talked, I noticed this vulnerability in his eyes, a sort of loneliness he couldn't hide. It wasn't in a self-pitying way, more like he'd forgotten what it was like to connect, to really talk. Hours must have passed. The cafe closed around us, and we took our conversation to a nearby bench under a flickering streetlight. He confessed how out of place he sometimes felt in big cities, always in a rush, but never really arriving anywhere. I told him about my restless nature, how I moved to this city to start fresh, but found myself feeling more lost than ever. Eventually, he looked at his watch, sighed, and stood up. "I should probably get back to my hotel. Early flight tomorrow." I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment, but he seemed to read it. "Hey, why don't you give me your number?" he asked, surprising me. "If fate wants us to cross paths again, maybe we will." I scribbled my number on a coffee-stained napkin, and he slipped it into his pocket with a grin. He left, and I watched him walk away, heart pounding. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again, but for once, I didn't worry about it. The night felt perfect just as it was, and I walked home feeling like I'd won something precious. 2 weeks later, as I was scrolling through my phone absent-mindedly, a message popped up. "Guess who found your napkin during a boring meeting? Coffee dare, round 2. My heart leapt, and I found myself grinning like a fool. Sometimes, taking a little risk was all it took to turn a random encounter into something unforgettable. I had this date once that still haunts me in ways that make me both cringe and laugh, but not in a good way. We met online, a seemingly perfect match in all the superficial ways that make you think, maybe this could work. He was charming in texts, funny even. We swapped playlists, compared notes on the best pasta recipes, and shared a few late-night you-up chats. So, by the time we decided to meet in person, I felt like I knew him pretty well, or at least a version of him he chose to reveal. But was I in for a wild ride of reality versus online persona? I arrived at this low-key cafe we'd agreed on. Nothing fancy, just cozy. I'd picked it for its vibe and decent coffee. I got there early and grabbed a small table by the window, thinking this is going to be good. No pressure, right? When he walked in, I recognized him immediately, but my heart sank a little. He looked different. Not in the online photos were outdated way, but more like put zero effort into looking presentable. His hair was unbrushed, his shirt wrinkled, and he wore flip-flops. To a cafe. In November, I brushed it off, deciding maybe he was just quirky or didn't put much stock in appearances. We ordered coffee, and the first 10 minutes were a safe zone. Polite chit-chat, a few awkward laughs. Then he leaned in, almost conspiratorially, and asked, "Have you ever considered what happens after we die?" I nearly choked on my coffee. I mumbled something about, "Oh, yeah, I think about it sometimes," but I didn't see where this was going. Apparently, he was deep into studying the afterlife and spiritual warfare. He went on a long tangent about spirits, energies, and even touched on reincarnation, none of which would have bothered me if it hadn't taken on such an intense, almost evangelical fervor. But I nodded along, trying to steer the conversation to something lighter, maybe music or travel, but he was having none of it. He launched into a spiel about how he was convinced he'd been a Roman soldier in a past life and had unfinished battles to attend to. When I tried to laugh it off as a joke, he looked at me dead serious and said, "No, you don't understand. I feel these memories vividly." At that point, my mind was doing somersaults, trying to figure out an exit plan without being rude. Things took an even stranger turn when he started asking probing questions about my family history. He leaned forward and whispered, "Any history of curses or spiritual encounters?" My brain froze, the kind of freeze where you're deciding whether to laugh or run. He then took out a small crystal from his pocket and held it between us, murmuring something about cleansing energies. I sat there, blinking, as he waved this crystal like it was a magic wand. And then, the piece de resistance. He explained that he didn't believe in traditional relationships. Monogamy, he said with the seriousness of a philosopher, is an illusion created to keep us in chains. He went on about his plans to start a community of lovers that would live together, free of jealousy or possessiveness. By now, I wasn't just contemplating the quickest exit. I was calculating the most polite way to survive the next 10 minutes. I faked a family emergency text, thanked him for the coffee, and practically ran out of there. When I got home, I deleted our chat history, blocked him on the dating app, and sat on my bed, staring at the wall in disbelief. That's when I realized I just narrowly escaped joining some weird cult commune, and I couldn't even blame anyone but myself for it. Dating was officially ruined. It was a Friday night, one of those sticky, humid summer evenings where even the breeze felt heavy. I had just wrapped up a particularly grueling week, and my friends knew exactly what I needed: drinks, dancing, and letting loose. We found ourselves at a new bar in town, one with dim lighting, an open-air patio, and a dance floor already alive with a crowd feeling the weekend vibes. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed, a place where the energy was as charged as I felt. After a few rounds, my friends and I were moving to the beat, totally engrossed in the music and each other. But it was only a matter of time before someone caught my eye across the room. He was leaning against the bar, a casual confidence about him that drew my attention right away. He had that easy, crooked smile, one that he flashed as soon as he saw me watching him. And, like a scene out of some ridiculous movie, he lifted his drink in a silent toast across the room. I'm not normally the type to be swept up in the mystery of a stranger, but the night had taken on a strange kind of magic. A couple of exchanged glances, and we somehow found ourselves sharing the same space, talking about everything and nothing. He was smart, funny, a little sarcastic, but in that way that made you want to keep him on his toes. By the time we were close enough to dance, I had almost forgotten everyone else around us. We moved in sync, laughing as the night blurred in a haze of music and half-shouted conversations. And then we were outside. The air was thick, warm, wrapping around us as we leaned against a wall, sharing breathless laughs and long, teasing glances. I could feel my heart pounding, but it wasn't from dancing. Before I knew it, we were wrapped up in each other, and the world faded out until there was only us, the night, and the thrill of the moment. It felt liberating, like shedding every care, every piece of routine or responsibility I had been weighed down with all week. We eventually ended up back at his place. It was impulsive, yes, but also exhilarating in a way that reminded me of being young, carefree, and invincible. The spontaneity of it all, the thrill of a night without expectations, left me feeling more alive than I had in a long time. In those hours, there was no tomorrow to worry about, no consequences or hesitations, just the raw, unfiltered experience. But morning has a way of stripping away the fantasy of the night before. The sunlight filtered in through his window, casting everything in a clarity that hadn't been there hours before. I woke up feeling that strange mix of satisfaction and unease, like something inside me was slightly off balance. I was alone in his bed. He'd gone to get coffee, and in those quiet moments, I could feel the weight of reality creeping back in, the familiar itch of self-doubt. I started running through every choice I had made the night before, dissecting every detail as if it would somehow give me answers to questions I wasn't even sure I was asking. Was this what I really wanted? Did I need this experience to feel fulfilled? Or was I using it as a distraction, a way to fill a void I hadn't acknowledged? I knew I had enjoyed myself. That was undeniable, but the thrill of it had started to fade, leaving only questions that sat heavy in my chest. When he returned, everything felt slightly awkward, like we were both aware of the unspoken rule that last night was supposed to stay in last night. He was sweet, though, offering me coffee and a lazy smile, and I tried to match his ease. But something had shifted, at least in me. The night had been magical, but the daylight stripped away the charm, leaving me feeling unexpectedly exposed. I left shortly after, making some excuse about plans with friends, and he didn't protest. On my way home, I felt like I was carrying two different versions of myself. The carefree girl who had embraced the night, and the quieter, more reflective version who was left to process it all. I couldn't help but wonder why I felt this strange pull between satisfaction and emptiness. Why something that had felt so liberating in the moment left me questioning what I was really looking for. Over the next few days, the experience lingered in my mind, refusing to settle into a tidy memory. I kept replaying parts of it, not just the thrill of being with someone new, but the way it made me question my own wants and needs. Was I really the type who could dive into these fleeting encounters without wanting something deeper? Or was I fooling myself into thinking that casual could be fulfilling? Maybe I'd been looking for a connection, a real one, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself. The night had been fun, a rush of adrenaline and excitement that had felt right in the moment. But afterward, I realized I craved something more than just the rush, something that would last beyond the night. I started to see that as liberating as casual encounters might feel, they didn't necessarily give me what I wanted at the end of the day. It was a lesson I hadn't expected to learn, a wake-up call wrapped in a night of fun. And while I didn't regret it, I knew it had changed something in me, shifted my perspective. The experience made me more honest with myself about what I was really searching for, a connection that wasn't just about filling a moment, but something that could fill the quiet spaces in between. There's this story my friend Joe likes to tell that makes everyone in the room laugh until they're gasping, but it's also got that dark, head-shaking kind of humor that leaves you wondering how things ever got that ridiculous in the first place. Joe's not a guy who complains, but this tale has turned into his personal legend. Whenever someone grumbles about an injustice, he's right there with, "Oh, you think that's bad? Let me tell you what happened with my old job." We all know what's coming, and we still lean in. Every time. Joe had been laid off from his tech job around the pandemic and had been job hunting for months. It was brutal out there. He'd sent applications to every corner of the country and had gone through multiple rounds of interviews with half a dozen companies. One company in particular, let's call them Omnisoft for the sake of suspense and plausible deniability, had strung him along for what seemed like forever. He'd gone through 3 rounds, each more elaborate than the last. The first was just a phone call with a recruiter who asked him the basic, "Tell me about yourself," questions, probably from a list she'd recycled 100 times. The second round was with some mid-level manager who got Joe all hyped up about the company's mission, promising big things and talking about how Joe's skills were a perfect fit. Joe had started to believe it himself. Round 3 came, and they wanted Joe to do this Herculean project. Something about optimizing an internal tool that was clunky and outdated. It wasn't a hypothetical exercise either. They gave him specific details and full access to the tool. He poured 2 weeks of effort into it, pulling a couple of all-nighters, and even consulted a friend who was an expert in that area. He presented it to the panel, who nodded appreciatively, jotting down notes like he was a magician who'd just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. They even hinted at a great offer if the higher-ups gave the green light. He felt like it was in the bag. Then came the silence. He checked his email a dozen times a day. His phone never left his side. Weeks passed, and nothing. No update, no rejection, not even a thanks, but no thanks. It was like Omnisoft had suddenly ceased to exist. And the worst part? Joe found out through LinkedIn that they'd hired someone else. Someone he'd worked with before who'd told him, "Oh yeah, I got in after one quick interview and a portfolio review. That's when Joe realized they just wanted him to fix their tool for free. It was brutal, but the kicker was this. Joe later noticed that his presentation, the one he'd spent 2 weeks perfecting, had been uploaded as an internal training resource. His work had become company property. That's the kind of thing Joe said that should be illegal. And who could disagree? Then there's the time I tried to buy tickets for a music festival in the city. It was one of those events that sells out fast, so I'd been refreshing the page with 2 different browsers like a madman, waiting for the ticket sales to go live. I got in fast, even managed to select my tickets, and was ready to hit checkout when poof, they vanished. Just like that. And not 30 seconds later, I see the same tickets on a third-party reseller website for triple the price. It's as if someone had just snatched them out of my hands and tossed them up for auction. Turns out a company bought the tickets in bulk, used bots to snap up all the best spots, and now they were up for grabs at an insane markup. The platform shrugged when I complained, and a customer service rep told me, with impressive nonchalance, that ticket resellers had no affiliation with them and nothing could be done. I ended up paying because I had friends coming in from out of town who'd already booked flights. I just kept thinking, how is this fair? You ban ticket resales for sports games, but music festivals are free game? People are making fortunes by basically hacking the ticket system, and no one's doing anything about it. It's highway robbery, just with a modern twist. Now, if you think that's bad, wait until you hear about this when I read on a forum about squatting laws. Picture this. A couple goes on a 2-week vacation. Nothing fancy, just a quick getaway to a rented cabin somewhere in the mountains. They come home, unlock their front door, and find strangers living in their house. Their furniture has been moved, their food half-eaten, and there's a guy in their favorite recliner. In utter disbelief, they call the cops. Now, any sane person would think this is a clear-cut case, right? Homeowners call the cops. Cops throw out the trespassers. But no, the cops shrug and say that the squatters have a right to be there until the matter is sorted out in court, because the squatters had this flimsy piece of paper claiming they rented the place from a friend of a friend. Turns out, these squatters were pros, con artists who moved from place to place, exploiting this legal loophole. It took months to get them out, and by the time they left, the couple's home was trashed. They'd ripped up carpets, left garbage everywhere, and even taken some of the appliances. And through it all, the homeowners were helpless, paying legal fees to fight a case that was open and shut to anyone with common sense. It just makes you wonder what laws were really made for. In the 10th grade, my high school had a Halloween dance that, to this day, I still remember for its wild series of events. Picture this. Our gym decked out with tacky fake spiderwebs, glowing orange lights, and a chocolate fountain that someone inevitably spiked with Mountain Dew. It was supposed to be a mellow school-sanctioned way for us to cut loose responsibly, but high schoolers and responsible don't exactly go hand in hand. This was the year everyone seemed determined to one-up each other, and for some reason, they decided the dance was the perfect venue. I remember the night starting out pretty calm. People in costumes, awkward dancing, teachers doing their best not to look horrified at our outfits. But just outside, by the gym's emergency exit, there was a group of juniors who decided it was the prime spot to light up. They weren't even being subtle about it. The door was cracked open to let the music and cool air drift outside. And sure enough, the distinct smell of something illegal wafted in. A chaperone, Mr. Davis, who everyone suspected knew exactly what that smell was from his own college days, caught a whiff, and his face went from mildly annoyed to red alert mode in a split second. He burst out through the doors, and I could only imagine what he was saying to them as they tried to put out their joints in sheer panic. Things went downhill from there. Word spread that the stoners had been caught, and a wave of excitement rippled through the dance floor. But just when we thought we had our drama for the night, someone broke out the booze, a flask hidden in a boot, of course. One guy, a senior named Jake, had managed to sneak in enough alcohol to share with at least half the football team. As the night wore on, Jake, who had clearly taken more than a few sips, decided it was the perfect time to let loose some pin-up feelings he had for his ex, who was dancing nearby with someone new. He staggered over and blurted out a string of profanities that seemed to echo in the gym. And before anyone knew it, a full-blown fight had erupted. Everyone around me was caught between running from the chaos and inching closer to see what would happen next. I could hear one of the chaperones frantically trying to radio for backup, while another yelled, "Stop! This isn't what Halloween is about," as if anyone was really going to listen. The fight didn't last long. It was quickly broken up by a combination of chaperones, a couple of brave teachers, and eventually the campus police. As things started to settle down, another twist came out of nowhere. A girl named Emily, dressed as a zombie bride, decided she had a bone to pick with the chocolate fountain and threw a fit, claiming it was possessed. She dramatically threw her hands up, accidentally knocking over the whole thing. It collapsed in a glorious splash, covering half the dance floor in chocolate. The teachers were at their wits' end. I remember Mrs. Green turning a shade of pale I'd never seen before, muttering, "This will be the last dance we ever have." The next day, the aftermath was almost as bad as the night itself. We all got pulled into an assembly and endured a lecture on the dangers of substance abuse and the need for school decorum. And, of course, as Mrs. Green had promised, they canceled all future Halloween dances. The whole thing turned into the stuff of high school legend. The stoners, the chocolate fountain, and Jake's dramatic showdown were whispered about for the rest of the year, and it became the story every incoming class wanted to hear. I'm not sure if they even remember what they wore that Halloween, but everyone remembers that night. We were inseparable for years, the kind of friends who could practically finish each other's sentences. Every weekend, we'd find ourselves holed up on my sofa with a stack of terrible movies and an embarrassing amount of snacks, laughing at each other's terrible jokes. It wasn't anything beyond friendship. That's what I told myself, anyway. I loved her, but I'd stuffed any trace of romantic feelings deep down, where I thought they'd never be found. And they weren't, at least until one unforgettable night. It was a sweltering Saturday in July. We'd both had long weeks and decided to kick back with drinks, way more than we typically did. She was venting about her job, the ridiculous demands, and I was laughing, already halfway through my second drink, feeling light. She leaned in closer than usual, her hand resting casually on my knee as she told a story. I laughed too hard at something she said, and suddenly, there was no space between us. It was the sort of silence that doesn't feel awkward, just inevitable. And then we kissed. I didn't think, I just went with it. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was that I've been holding back for so long that it felt like it was bursting out of me. The next morning, I woke up tangled in her, and reality hit like a hammer. She woke up shortly after, and there was this unspoken agreement in the room that we wouldn't dissect what happened. We made coffee and talked about completely mundane things like it was any other morning after a movie marathon. But we weren't the same. Something had shifted in the air between us, something palpable and electric. In the weeks that followed, things got strange. We'd go from acting like nothing had changed to sharing these loaded glances that were hard to ignore. A part of me was terrified to mess up what we had, but another part wondered if this was what we were meant to be all along. That tension built up until one night. She asked if I wanted to talk about it. I shrugged, feeling defensive, but she insisted, maybe we can't just ignore it forever. I wanted to tell her I had feelings for her, that maybe I always had, but the words felt lodged in my throat. She looked at me, waiting, and when I couldn't say anything, she laughed in that way that wasn't really laughing and said, "It's okay. Let's just be friends." Something inside me cracked, but I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Things cooled between us after that. We'd still hang out, but it felt forced, like we were trying too hard to go back to what we were. She started dating someone else a few months later, and I felt like I was watching my chance slip away. I convinced myself that she was happy, and I tried to be supportive, but it tore me up inside. Eventually, I got into a relationship too, with someone who was wonderful and kind, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was settling. A couple of years went by, and we drifted. Life got in the way like it always does. I moved to a different city, got serious with my girlfriend, but there was always that lingering what if. We still messaged each other occasionally, checking in every now and then, but it was never like it was before. Then one day, out of the blue, I got a text from her. "Hey, I'm going to be in town next month. Want to catch up?" My heart skipped a beat. I tried to play it cool, typed out something casual, but inside, every old feeling was reignited. a mess of hope and nostalgia I'd thought I'd buried. The night we met up, it was like no time had passed. We fell into old rhythms, laughed at the same stupid things. After a few hours of reminiscing, we ended up walking by the river, talking about everything and nothing. And then, just as we stopped by this spot overlooking the water, she said, "You know, I always wondered what would have happened if we hadn't just let things go." I didn't expect her to say that. I looked at her, trying to read her expression, but she was staring at the water, her voice barely a whisper. There it was, that question we'd both avoided for so long, finally out in the open. "Me too," I admitted, feeling my heart racing. She turned to me, a small smile playing on her lips, and for the first time in years, it felt like that door was open again. We stood there, inches apart, just looking at each other, and I realized something. The years, the relationships, the distance, it had all just been noise. This moment, this chance, was something I'd wanted since that first night we crossed the line from friends to something more. I leaned in, and she didn't pull away. We spent that night just talking, laying everything bare, every regret, every feeling we'd ignored. By morning, I knew we couldn't pretend to be just friends anymore. It was terrifying, but it felt like we were finally taking a risk worth taking. Today, we're together, and it's messy and imperfect and everything I'd hoped for. It took years, mistakes, and heartbreak to get here, but somehow, I feel like it was worth every twist and turn. She's still my best friend, my partner in every sense. And while I can't say how it'll end, I finally feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. The first day I stepped into that room, I was barely holding it together. I'd spent days beforehand convincing myself this was the right move. Needed the money, wanted the independence. I'd been drawn to the allure of cam work because it seemed like a way to keep my life private while still stepping out of my comfort zone. But even after I'd made up my mind, nothing could have prepared me for that moment. I'd set up the tiny corner in my room with a cheap backdrop and some fairy lights, trying to create some ambience in the chaos that was my tiny studio apartment. I had a whole script in my head, lines I'd rehearsed to sound confident, sultry, in control. What I felt, though, was raw and exposed. I remember sitting there in front of the webcam, staring at the start stream button like it was some kind of portal. When I finally clicked it, the screen flashed, and suddenly there were people, real people, watching me. The first few comments popped up faster than I'd anticipated, and all at once, it was real. Some of the messages were friendly, welcoming, but then there were others that threw me off balance immediately. One guy's comment was blunt and vulgar, and I felt myself freeze up, my heart pounding. I took a deep breath and tried to brush it off, focusing instead on a viewer named Mr. Beeswax, who was asking me about my day, like a normal conversation. I latched onto that like a lifeline, forcing myself to respond casually, keeping the panic at bay. As I settled into the chat, things started to get a little easier. I was laughing, responding to messages, even joking around. I wasn't quite in character yet, but I could feel myself loosening up. The nerves were still there, bubbling just under the surface, but I pushed past them, reminding myself why I was doing this. The chat rolled on, and I began to relax until the numbers shot up out of nowhere. One minute I had maybe 10 viewers, and the next it was 50, then 100. I remember thinking there had to be a mistake, some glitch, but then I realized my stream had been featured on a random page that gave me more exposure than I'd bargained for. My hands went clammy, and I felt a wave of pure adrenaline. It was like standing on stage under a spotlight with no script. I laughed awkwardly, hoping no one could see how wide-eyed I was. But the funny thing? Once the initial shock wore off, the energy of the crowd somehow pulled me in. Messages started coming in faster than I could keep up with. Compliments, questions, requests, and suddenly I felt like I had control again, almost like I was hosting my own little show. I told a silly story about my cat, tried out a few one-liners, and people loved it. Some sent tips just for making them laugh. And I realized then that this job could be as much about my personality as anything else. There was a moment in that first stream I'll never forget. A regular came into the chat, someone who I recognized from a test stream I'd done the night before. They left me a tip with a message that said, "You're a natural." I didn't expect how much that would mean to me, but it grounded me, gave me a boost. I felt a strange kind of validation from that. By the end of the night, I was sitting there in disbelief, counting the tips I'd made. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than I'd ever made in a single day at my last job. When I finally ended the stream and closed my laptop, I just sat there, staring into space. I felt a mixture of exhaustion, pride, and a weird kind of exhilaration. It wasn't like anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't just a job. It was performance, it was connection, and maybe a little bit of therapy, too. That first day was a roller coaster, but by the end, I felt more alive than I had in years. The taxi stopped outside my old neighborhood just after dusk. Everything looked softer in the twilight, like the dimming sky was covering up the scars time had left on the place. I paid the driver and stepped out, closing my eyes as I took a deep breath. The air was the same, that smell of wet earth and gasoline that had always clung to this street. I hadn't been here in nearly a decade, but each detail seemed engraved in my mind, from the crack in the sidewalk by the mailbox to the creaky porch swing that hung like a tired sentinel from my childhood home. Mom opened the door before I even had a chance to knock, her face lit by the warm glow spilling from the hallway behind her. Her eyes searched mine, and for a second, we just stood there, suspended in an unspoken truce. She hugged me, tight and quick, as if making sure I was real before she let go. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said, her voice just a little too soft, too carefully neutral. "I wanted to," I replied, feeling the small suitcase in my hand grow heavier with every step I took into the house. It smelled the same, faintly of lavender and coffee. The wallpaper in the living room was peeling, and the carpet was thinner in patches, as though the house had aged with her. The first night back was tense, the silence thick and brittle. Mom and I exchanged polite words, as if we were strangers performing some quiet ritual. We sat at the kitchen table, each sip of tea punctuated by the small clink of porcelain, each shared glance weighted by all the things neither of us was saying. I finally cleared my throat, breaking the uneasy silence. "So, how are things?" She gave me a tight smile and shrugged. "They're fine. I manage." The next few days passed in a similar rhythm, each one marked by small, almost meaningless conversations. We talked about the weather, the neighbors, the grocery store that had gone out of business. I'd find her in the kitchen every morning, stirring her tea and staring into the distance, like she was somewhere far away. And I'd watch her, searching her face for any trace of the mother I remembered. One afternoon, I wandered into the backyard, where the old garden shed still stood at the edge of the lawn, looking like it might fall over if someone so much as sneezed near it. I remembered hiding out there as a kid, escaping the summer heat and pretending it was my own little world. Now, it seemed almost laughably small, as if it had shrunk over the years. I pushed open the door, expecting to be greeted by dust and cobwebs, but instead, I found a small assortment of neatly labeled boxes stacked against the wall. Curiosity got the best of me, and I knelt down, running my fingers over the labels. Photo albums, dad's tools, kid stuff. I opened one, revealing an assortment of my childhood trinkets, an old action figure, a handful of marbles, a crumpled drawing I'd made in kindergarten. I smiled to myself, remembering the hours I'd spent lost in these little treasures. Later, as I sat with Mom on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I found myself asking her about the shed. "You kept all that stuff," I said, trying to keep my voice light, casual. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. "I thought maybe one day you'd want it." I nodded, unsure what to say. There was a rawness to her words, a quiet acknowledgement of all the years we'd missed. I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest, like I was mourning something I couldn't quite name. The days continued in that uneasy rhythm, each one filled with small tasks that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. I helped Mom clean out the garage, sort through old papers, fix the broken latch on the kitchen window. Each task was a quiet way of reconnecting, of reestablishing some fragile connection that had frayed over the years. One evening, we found ourselves in the attic, going through boxes of old family photos. Mom handed me a picture of myself as a toddler, chubby and grinning, with a wild mop of curls that seemed to take up half my head. She smiled as she looked at it, a rare softness coming over her face. "You were such a handful back then," she murmured, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "Always getting into things, always asking questions." I laughed, the sound surprising me. "Guess some things never change." She looked at me, her eyes shining with something I couldn't quite place. For a moment, I felt like a kid again, sitting at her feet, wide-eyed and eager to understand the world. It was strange and comforting, this brief flicker of closeness, like a glimpse of something we'd lost along the way. The following morning, I woke to find her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an old, faded postcard. She looked up as I entered, her eyes distant. "Do you remember this?" she asked, holding it up. I recognized it instantly, a postcard I'd sent her from a school trip when I was 14. I'd signed it with a hastily scrawled "Love you," a gesture that felt almost obligatory at the time. But now, seeing it in her hands, I felt an unexpected pang of guilt. "Yeah, I remember," I said softly, taking a seat across from her. She traced her finger over the words, her gaze distant. "I kept every letter you ever sent. Every card, every little note." I was silent, unsure how to respond. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that caught me off guard, a kind of quiet yearning that made my chest ache. It was as though she was reaching out, trying to bridge the gap between us with these small, forgotten fragments of our shared history. The days slipped by, and I found myself lingering, unable to pull away completely. Each moment felt like a small act of forgiveness, a slow healing of old wounds. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic resolution, just a quiet understanding that we were both trying, in our own flawed ways, to hold on to what we had left. On my last night, we sat on the porch in comfortable silence, the air heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the quiet finality of it. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her, seeing the faint lines around her eyes, the silver threads in her hair. She was both familiar and foreign, a reflection of the woman I remembered and a stranger I was just beginning to know. "I'll be back," I promised, though we both knew it wasn't that simple. She smiled a sad, knowing smile and squeezed my hand. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. Not a resolution, exactly, but a quiet acceptance of all the things we'd left unsaid. As I drove away, the house faded in the rearview mirror, a small, distant silhouette against the rising dawn. But the memories lingered, filling the space around me like a soft, steady pulse. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to run from them. They were a part of me, just as she was, and I was finally ready to carry them forward. I always thought life was a string of predictable moments, a rhythm. Wake up, work, come home, sleep. Every now and then, maybe an impromptu dinner with friends or a family reunion, but mostly I lived within a narrow lane. I was a marketing consultant with a 9-to-5 that kept me tethered to a screen. I liked it, or rather, I liked the routine, but that was before a Tuesday morning, a day like any other, changed everything. It started with a postcard, a standard 4x6 card, tucked into my mailbox between the usual bills and ads. It had no return address, just an image of a lighthouse on the front and a short, cryptic note on the back. "Come see the light at dawn, just once." It was signed a friend. The handwriting looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. I stuffed it in my coat pocket, intending to forget it, chalking it up to a prank, or maybe even junk mail with a personal touch. But that note nagged me all day. By lunch, I was holding it in my hand, tracing the letters with my thumb, and by the end of the day, I knew I wouldn't let it go. "Come see the light at dawn." What did it mean? Was it a metaphor? A hidden message? That night, lying awake, I wondered if dawn was literal. There was an old lighthouse on the coast, about 45 minutes from my apartment. I hadn't been there since I was a kid on a school trip, and I barely remembered it. But I was drawn to it now, inexplicably. Without really deciding, I found myself setting an alarm for 4:30 a.m., packing a bag with a thermos of coffee, and getting in my car before my brain could tell me to turn back. I drove through the dark, empty streets, all the while wondering if I was insane for chasing after a postcard. But as I neared the coast, the sky began to lighten, and I felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of anticipation. When I got to the beach, the lighthouse loomed ahead, its silhouette against the pre-dawn glow. I parked, walked down the beach, and felt a hush fall over everything. No other cars, no other people, just the sound of waves crashing against the shore. I waited as the sun started to break over the horizon, turning the water gold and pink. It was beautiful, serene, a sunrise I'd have missed 1,000 times over if it weren't for that postcard. I stood there just breathing in the salt air, feeling that maybe, just maybe, this postcard had been onto something. But then I noticed a figure standing near the lighthouse. A woman, maybe in her 40s, bundled in a thick coat, holding a camera. She seemed to be watching me, though I couldn't tell for sure. There was a familiarity about her that stirred something in my memory, like an old photograph you can't quite place. Our eyes met, and she gave me a small, knowing smile, then motioned for me to come closer. Against every instinct telling me to play it safe, I approached. "Did you get my postcard?" she asked like we were old friends. "Yes," I replied slowly, still searching her face. "Do we know each other?" Her smile softened, and for a moment, I thought she looked almost sad. "In a way, yes," she said, "but maybe not in the way you're thinking." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a page where she'd jotted down what looked like an address. Handing it to me, she said, "If you're curious enough to come here, then maybe you're curious enough to find out what's next." I took the notebook, scanning the address. It wasn't far from here, just a small town about 20 minutes away, and she was gone before I could ask anything else. It was so surreal, like meeting a character from a dream, someone who knows you but exists just outside of memory. I sat in my car for a good 10 minutes, deciding if I'd take the next step or not. I was already late for work. I could just forget this whole morning, toss the notebook, and move on. But something told me that if I did, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. So I followed the address. I arrived at a small house tucked at the end of a cul-de-sac, ordinary in every way. When I knocked, a man in his 50s answered. He looked at me curiously, as if I was someone he half expected to see. Before I could explain, he invited me in, offered me tea, and started talking. His name was Paul, and he explained he'd been reaching out to a few people, tracking down anyone who used to be a part of a small, experimental summer camp he'd run 20 years ago, when I vaguely remembered attending as a shy, awkward kid. It was designed to encourage self-reflection, creativity, and pushing limits, something that had apparently made a lasting impact on most of the attendees. I barely remembered the camp at first, but the more he talked, the more it came back in waves. A treehouse where we used to meet for talks, a talent show under the stars, even a game of hide-and-seek where I'd gotten completely lost, only to be found hours later by a counselor who'd sat with me by the lake until I felt calm again. Paul explained that he'd been reaching out to us now, all these years later, to ask one simple question. Have you become the person you wanted to be? He wasn't judging, he said. He just thought that in today's world, most people never even stop to ask that question of themselves. I didn't have an answer. Sitting in his small kitchen, sipping lukewarm tea, I realized I'd never once thought about what I wanted to be. I'd chosen a career, settled into routine, but had I chosen it consciously? Or had I simply fallen into the life I thought I was supposed to live? Paul didn't press me. He simply handed me a small, old journal, my journal from camp, and told me to read it whenever I was ready. Then we said our goodbyes. That night, back home, I opened the journal. In my young handwriting, full of awkward doodles and half-formed sentences, I found pages and pages of dreams. Things I'd wanted to do, places I wanted to go, fears I wanted to conquer. There were entries about wanting to travel, try new things, live adventurously. Somehow, somewhere along the way, I'd shelved those ideas for someday. It's been a few months since that morning. I still work in marketing, still wake up at the same time, but I've also started making small changes. I took an art class, I'm planning a trip overseas, and every morning I look at that postcard, the one that started it all, and remember that dawn on the beach, that light that felt like a new beginning. Sometimes life doesn't change in one grand sweep. Sometimes it's just a postcard, a sunrise, and a stranger asking a question that leads you right back to yourself. I was in my early 30s, working in a marketing job I could only describe as just fine. It was stable, well-paying, and by most measures secure. But if you'd have asked me where I saw myself in 5 years, I probably would have shrugged and changed the subject. There was this nagging sense that I was missing something, though I couldn't figure out what. One late Saturday night, I was scrolling through social media, as one does when they're avoiding thinking too hard about their life. That's when I stumbled upon an article on photography. It was mostly the basics, things about lighting, composition, editing. But for whatever reason, I was hooked. I'd always liked taking photos on my phone, just random things like clouds over buildings or my morning coffee. But this article took me down a rabbit hole. I ended up reading about aperture, shutter speed, ISO, all things that felt way over my head. I convinced myself that the urge to get a camera would pass. I couldn't be one of those people who just invested hundreds of dollars into a hobby, right? But the feeling stuck around, and a week later, on impulse, I ordered a beginner's DSLR from some discount site. I told myself I'd return it if it didn't work out. When it arrived, it felt like I'd just unboxed my own secret, a slice of excitement that had been missing from my life for a long time. The first few weeks were, well, humbling. I had no clue what I was doing. I messed up settings, the lighting always looked off, and there were way too many blurry shots of my dog. But it was fun. For the first time in a long time, I found myself itching to get out of the house just to take pictures, even if most of them weren't great. One weekend, I drove out to this abandoned railroad station I'd read about online. Supposedly, it had been built in the 1920s and then just left to decay. It was the kind of place that practically begged to be photographed. The walls were crumbling, and weeds sprouted up through cracks in the floor. Rusted old signs hung by a thread, and an eerie silence hung over the whole scene. I was completely absorbed, taking shot after shot, experimenting with angles and perspectives. By the time I got home, my camera was full, and I spent the rest of the evening editing photos on my laptop. One shot in particular looked half decent. It was this close-up of a broken-down train wheel, with the sunlight casting long, shadowy lines across the metal. It had this gritty feel that made it seem like it could be from a different era entirely. I had no idea if it was good by anyone else's standards, but I liked it. On a whim, I uploaded the shot to an online photography forum. I didn't expect much, maybe a few nice job comments if I was lucky. To my surprise, people reacted. It was a mix of amateur photographers and people just passionate about urban decay photography, apparently. They started asking me technical questions about the shot. Some people even praised my eye for detail, which was news to me. The whole experience felt like a compliment from a stranger in a foreign language. You're pretty sure it's a good thing, but it's hard to believe it's actually directed at you. Encouraged, I began uploading more of my shots from different outings. Abandoned warehouses, overgrown parks, cracked roads that seemed to lead nowhere. I chased those scenes whenever I could. Before I knew it, I had a small following. People began reaching out to me, sharing their own photography tips, or even asking if I could show them around some of the places I'd photographed. Then one day, I got a message from someone with an email signature I didn't recognize. They claimed to be an editor for a well-known photography magazine and were interested in featuring one of my images in their upcoming issue. I was convinced it was a prank, or worse, some sort of scam to get me to pay for something I didn't need. But after some back and forth, I realized it was legitimate. They offered a small fee. Nothing life-changing, but the thought of having my photo published? That felt huge. When the issue finally came out, I bought several copies. There was my name printed right next to my photo, immortalized in print. It was surreal. My friends laughed when I insisted on signing their copies, calling me the artist, but they were genuinely thrilled for me. And for the first time, I felt like maybe I was onto something, like this wasn't just a hobby, but something more. Not long after, people started contacting me for prints. This was unexpected. The idea of selling my work had never crossed my mind. But as the requests kept coming in, I decided to open a small online store. It was a shoestring operation, with me doing the packaging and shipping myself, but the orders kept trickling in. It was bizarre, seeing people across the country willing to pay for my photos, something that started as a quiet, personal passion. And then came the day when a small business reached out, asking if I'd be interested in shooting some photos for their new website. They specialized in restoring and selling antique furniture, and they felt that my abandoned, rustic aesthetic fit their brand perfectly. I agreed nervously, but as I got to work, it felt natural, like I'd found this rhythm I didn't know I had. Fast forward a few years, and things look wildly different. My side project turned into a steady business. I quit my marketing job, which felt like jumping off a cliff, but somehow, I haven't regretted it for a second. I never would have guessed that a camera, something I bought on impulse, could open so many doors. Now, I wake up excited to see where the day will take me, whether it's scouting out a new location or working with a small business to help bring their vision to life. What I've learned along the way is that the best things don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes, they show up quietly, under the guise of a late-night impulse or a hobby you never thought would be anything more. And when you're willing to give those things a shot, even if they feel a little frivolous or silly, they can turn into the kind of success you'd never see coming. I may not know where this path is leading, but for the first time, I don't mind the uncertainty. There's something magical about following a passion just because it feels right. About 3 years ago, I found myself in a crowded little cafe in Seattle, nursing a strong black coffee as the rain peppered the windows. I'd arrived early, as I often did, for an appointment that wasn't due for another hour. You'd think I'd remember what led me there, but honestly, I was on autopilot back then, stumbling through each day, working at a job I didn't really care for, and just moving through the motions. This was supposed to be a client meeting, but that rainy morning, it turned into something much more, something that even now I think about when I'm alone in a quiet room. I noticed him right away. He was seated 2 tables down, looking every bit as worn out by life as I felt. There was something about him, a quiet intensity. He was maybe in his late 50s, with graying hair and the kind of face that had clearly seen things. He had a journal open in front of him, scribbling furiously, as if trying to pin down some elusive thought. I couldn't help but feel that he was just as out of place in that cafe as I was. After a while, he looked up and caught my gaze, and I did that awkward, polite thing people do, pretend not to be looking. But to my surprise, he smiled and nodded, as if we were old friends, or maybe just 2 strangers who understood something about each other without needing to say it. I nodded back, and before I knew it, he'd motioned for me to join him. Normally, I'd have brushed it off, but something told me to walk over. Mind if I join? I asked, feeling strangely out of place, like I'd been plucked out of my routine and into some other universe. Please, he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. He looked at me as if he'd been expecting me. We sat there in silence for a while, the air thick with some unspoken understanding. Finally, he broke the silence. You look like you're waiting for something, he said, his voice low but clear. Or maybe someone. I laughed a bit uncomfortably. I guess I am. Meeting a client here, actually. He nodded thoughtfully. Funny how we're always waiting, even when we're not. Waiting for the next day, the next opportunity, the next big thing. Life has us on hold, doesn't it? His words struck a chord, and I found myself leaning in. Yeah, I guess I feel that way. Like I'm biding my time. His gaze sharpened. Then what's stopping you? That question, it hit hard. I wanted to brush it off with some witty comment, but I realized I didn't have an answer, not a real one. We spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing. He told me he used to work as a journalist, back when he thought he'd change the world with his words. Turns out the world doesn't want to be changed, he said, chuckling darkly. At least, not by the likes of us. He was candid in a way people rarely are. He admitted to his regrets, his mistakes, how he'd lost touch with his daughter after his divorce, how he sometimes wondered if he'd even mattered to anyone. There was an honesty to him that I hadn't felt in my life for a long time. As the conversation drifted, he shared something that gave me chills. You know, I used to think that people had to find their purpose, like it was this holy grail. But now I wonder, maybe purpose is just what you choose to believe. Maybe we invent it so life feels less empty. We sat in silence after that, each of us absorbing what he'd said, as if we'd both suddenly realized something neither of us could quite name. Finally, I glanced at the time, realizing my client was due any minute. I told him I had to go, feeling like I was breaking some unspoken spell between us. As I gathered my things, he scribbled something on a napkin and handed it to me. In case you ever want to talk again. Sometimes it helps to know someone out there remembers you. He smiled, and I felt a strange sense of loss, as if I were leaving a part of myself behind. I took the napkin, thanked him, and left to meet my client. I figured I'd never see him again, and maybe that was okay. But later, as I left the cafe, I noticed something strange. The napkin he'd given me had 2 words on it. Look closer. Beneath it, a tiny web address was scrawled in barely legible handwriting. Curious, I pulled out my phone and typed it in. The link took me to a simple website, just a blank white page with a single question at the top. What do you live for? Below it, a box invited me to type an answer. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the question pressing down on me. For once, I couldn't dismiss it. After a few minutes, I typed, to find meaning. To my surprise, the page changed, revealing a list of anonymous answers others had left. Some were profound, others mundane, but each one felt like a glimpse into someone's soul. For my daughter. For music. For the chance to see tomorrow. There was even one that read, because I haven't found a reason not to. I closed the site, feeling strangely vulnerable. I thought about him for weeks after, wondering what kind of man he truly was. Maybe he was just a stranger passing through. Or maybe he was someone who'd seen too much of life's rough edges and was trying to make sense of it all. Either way, he'd left a mark, a question that lingered in my mind. Months passed, and that tiny conversation spurred something inside me. I made changes, little ones at first, reconnected with people I'd lost touch with, picked up hobbies I'd abandoned. I found myself considering that question more often, realizing how much of my life I'd spent in a sort of holding pattern, waiting for something external to tell me what to do, who to be. Then about a year later, I found myself back in that same cafe, though not intentionally. I was meeting a friend this time, catching up, when I noticed something tucked under the edge of the table, a napkin. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, heart pounding as I picked it up. Scrawled on it, in handwriting that looked achingly familiar, were the same 2 words, look closer. I never saw him again, but the napkin stayed with me. I still don't have all the answers, and maybe I never will. But every time I see those words, I'm reminded that purpose isn't something that finds us. It's something we create moment by moment, with each small choice. So here I am, piecing together my own version of meaning in a life that, for so long, I let pass me by. And in some strange way, that stranger's question, what do you live for, is what I'm still trying to answer. But I know now it's a question worth asking. I was on the other side of the planet, trying to start fresh in Canada after getting accepted into university, leaving my messy family drama behind in France. My mom threw a barbecue to celebrate with friends and family before I left. My best friend, Sophie, who lived far away, stayed over since it was late by the time the crowd thinned out. I was deep in conversation with another friend about what life would be like in Canada, drinking way too much wine. I didn't notice at first, but Sophie and my dad were laughing and talking in the kitchen, sipping on even more drinks. Eventually, I crashed, barely making it to my room, half-dressed. But when I woke up and went to the guest room where Sophie had stayed, her bed was untouched. I wandered through the house, checking the kitchen, the living room. Nothing. My heart started pounding. And then I pieced it together. My dad and Sophie were laughing together alone, late at night. I pushed it out of my mind, convincing myself it couldn't be possible. But I couldn't find her anywhere, and my mind wouldn't let me rest. She stumbled out of my dad's room, looking disheveled but trying to act casual. The way she quickly mumbled, "Oh, just needed to talk to him about something," gave her away. My stomach flipped. I could barely look her in the eye. I pulled her aside and asked, not even knowing what I expected to hear, what happened. She didn't meet my gaze, just muttered something about getting emotional and comforting each other. My mom overheard some of our hushed conversation, and her face drained of all color. She didn't say a word at first, just stared at me, then Sophie, and finally my dad, who was pretending nothing had happened. Later, Mom cornered him and asked him directly, and he brushed it off with an, "Oh, we just had a few drinks. Nothing serious." But I knew from the look on his face he was lying. The aftermath was tense, like walking on a frozen lake, hearing cracks every step of the way. My parents had been on the verge of divorce anyway, but this was the final blow. My mom stopped speaking to him except for essential details about my younger sister. Sophie tried to text me to explain. I couldn't bring myself to read her messages. She was my closest friend, the one person I thought would always have my back. And then she did this? I told her we were done, but it left a bitterness I couldn't shake. My dad? I couldn't look at him the same way. We barely spoke before I left for Canada, and when I returned to France, we were practically strangers living under the same roof. Years later, I occasionally bump into Sophie when I visit home, and we do this polite nod, like we're neighbors rather than people who once shared everything. She's moved on, or pretends to have, but I don't think I'll ever fully trust someone that close to me. The music was already thumping when I walked into the party, lights low and pulsing in time with a bass line that seemed to resonate in my chest. My friends had dragged me out tonight, their favorite mission being to get me out of my shell whenever they felt I'd been too serious for too long. As the evening wore on, though, I felt myself start to relax, the mix of drinks and loud laughter wearing down the edges of whatever tension I'd brought with me. And that's when I saw him. Tall, with an easy grin and a magnetic kind of energy. He was the sort of person you can't help but notice even in a packed room. He looked over, caught my eye, and before I could even think about it, I smiled back. It felt like a game, one I hadn't known I wanted to play, but now that I was all in. After a while, he made his way over, and we fell into a rhythm that was easy, natural. We laughed, talked, danced, more like swayed with abandon, our movements syncing with the music and each other. It felt like everything and nothing at once, just being in the moment. I didn't ask too many questions. It was like the energy around us held a silent agreement. This night was just about fun, about letting go. As the night wore on, we ended up outside, away from the noise, but still wrapped in the heat of it all. We were standing close, his arm around my shoulders, my heart racing in a way that felt foreign and thrilling. It was one of those summer nights that felt endless, the air thick with possibility. When he leaned in, his lips meeting mine, it was like we'd crossed some unspoken boundary. I was all in, swept up in the intoxicating mix of spontaneity and curiosity. We took a cab back to his place, laughing the entire ride, caught up in the wild, reckless joy of feeling utterly unburdened. Everything was a blur of hands, soft words, and shared breath as we finally got to his apartment, barely making it to the door before we were lost in each other again. It was exhilarating in a way I hadn't felt in years, as though this night was a secret we'd promised to keep. When I woke up, it was to the pale gray light of morning seeping through his blinds. I took a moment, lying there in the unfamiliar room, staring at the ceiling, wondering what to do next. It felt like I'd just shaken off a dream, the details of the night slipping through my fingers. I looked over at him, still fast asleep, his face softened in a way that was disarming. Part of me wanted to stay there, but another, louder part was already feeling the pangs of reality setting in. After a quiet moment of indecision, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. I grabbed my things, slipping out of his apartment and into the morning light, heart still pounding. The cool air was a shock, the outside world feeling different, starker than it had the night before. As I walked home, I tried to process the jumble of feelings bouncing around in my head. It was one thing to embrace a wild night, but another to face the morning after, when the magic and mystery had faded into daylight. For days afterward, I found myself thinking back to that night, replaying the details, wondering why it had left me feeling so complicated. There was a thrill, no doubt about it, but beneath that, a hollowness I hadn't expected. It had been fun, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I'd been searching for something deeper, even if I hadn't realized it at the time. I wanted the adventure, yes, but part of me also wanted to matter to someone beyond a single night. I had thought I'd known what I wanted, but that experience left me questioning if I'd just been masking a loneliness I didn't want to admit to. It made me think about the kinds of connections I was really looking for, connections that didn't dissolve with the morning light, but could carry through it, something solid that didn't fade when the night ended. Since then, I've taken my time, choosing carefully who I let close. That night taught me that while wild, impulsive moments have their charm, they don't necessarily fill the parts of me that yearn for something lasting. And as much as I enjoyed the thrill, I've learned that there's a difference between filling a moment and finding someone who fills the quiet spaces in between. Back in junior year, my school had this huge field trip to a water park that was supposed to be a wholesome day of slipping down slides and raiding the snack bar. But of course, we were a pack of hormonal, rowdy teenagers who couldn't resist the urge to turn everything into pure chaos. There was this unspoken rule that nobody dared to follow the actual itinerary our teachers had painstakingly crafted. So, while they herded everyone to the wave pool and kept giving their stay with your group speeches, a few of us made our escape to the more interesting areas of the park. Things got wild fast. First off, two of my friends, Max and Tyler, decided to kick things up a notch by sneaking off to one of those massive water slides that required rafts. They thought it would be hilarious to steal one of the inflatable rafts, drag it over to the kiddie pool, and use it there as if it were some grand pirate ship. So there they were, floating along while kids and their parents gave them horrified looks. But they didn't care. They just kept circling and declaring new territories while trying to dodge lifeguards. Then, just when we thought Max and Tyler had already peaked, they noticed a few teachers heading our way, probably tipped off by the chaos coming from the kiddie pool. They bailed and abandoned the raft, darting back through the crowds to disappear into the main part of the park. But Tyler, who was always one to take things too far, slipped away from the group again. This time, he spotted the costume mascot of the park, a poor teenage intern sweating it out in a giant dolphin costume. Without missing a beat, Tyler decided he wanted a picture with the dolphin. But instead of asking like a normal person, he bear-hugged it from behind, yelling, "Look, it's my long-lost cousin." The dolphin mascot stumbled, lost balance, and fell headfirst into the splash pad area, where a bunch of toddlers were playing. Parents screamed, the toddlers started crying, and the dolphin's massive head popped off, revealing a sweaty, embarrassed kid who looked like he was about to quit on the spot. At this point, the teachers had fully caught wind of our antics and were closing in, red-faced and visibly furious. We knew we were in trouble, but we weren't done yet. Someone whispered, "Hide in the lazy river." So naturally, we all sprinted over and threw ourselves into the lazy river, grabbing tubes and floating along as innocently as we could. We thought we were in the clear until we saw one of our teachers, Mrs. Hamilton, standing by the edge with her hands on her hips, glaring down at us like we were prisoners trying to escape Alcatraz. In one last-ditch attempt to dodge her, we all ducked underwater at once, hoping to look like a bunch of random kids just floating along. But Mrs. Hamilton didn't buy it. She waded right into the lazy river, fully clothed, and grabbed Max by the arm like some kind of righteous lifeguard dragging a delinquent to shore. By the time we all got pulled out, soaking wet and busted, the rest of the students had heard about our stunts. We became infamous. Everyone wanted to know if it was true that we'd tried to commandeer a kiddie pool raft, kidnap the dolphin, and narrowly escaped the wrath of Mrs. Hamilton in the lazy river. And the best part? None of us even got permanently banned from the park. We did, however, get a 3-day in-school suspension where the entire time, teachers kept coming in to shake their heads and say, "I hope you learned something from this." We just nodded, knowing we'd actually only learned one thing, that we had pulled off the most memorable field trip our school had ever seen. I thought I'd hit the jackpot with Josh. We met at a friend's rooftop party, where he made some ridiculous joke about horoscopes that actually made me laugh out loud, despite my usual indifference to astrology. He was just my type too, easygoing, charming, and a little rough around the edges. We swapped numbers, and the chemistry was instant. Texts flowed effortlessly, and it wasn't long before he asked me out to dinner. I was actually excited, which felt like a minor miracle after so many dreadful dates. I put on my favorite dress and arrived at the restaurant with butterflies in my stomach. When I got there, Josh was already seated, casually leaning back with this roguish smile that could probably get him out of any traffic ticket. He looked even better than I remembered. He stood up, gave me a quick hug, and launched into an enthusiastic spiel about the menu. He knew it by heart, raving about his favorite dishes. I thought it was sweet, like he was really invested in making sure I had the best time. The conversation flowed, and after a while, I noticed he was drinking his wine faster than I was. Every few minutes, he'd refill his glass, going on and on about his job, his dog, and his crazy stories from his college days. The story started off charming, mostly about pranks he'd pulled, or places he'd traveled. But gradually, his tales took a strange turn. He began talking about his exploits, which he described with a level of pride I found unsettling. I tried steering the conversation toward lighter topics, hoping he'd follow my lead, but he was already a few glasses in and seemed determined to impress me with his bad boy antics. He regaled me with the tale of a party where he almost got arrested, followed by a wink and a laugh that didn't sit right, and a time he totally ghosted a girl he'd been seeing. He laughed at his own jokes, as though expecting me to find his recklessness endearing. I sat there, nodding along, slowly realizing I might be on a date with the human embodiment of every red flag I'd ever ignored. At some point, he noticed I wasn't laughing as much, and he squinted at me, looking slightly confused. "You're not into bad boys, are you?" he asked a little too loudly. I laughed nervously and said, "Depends on the boy, I guess." He shrugged, clearly unbothered, and went on to ask me if I'd ever done something wild and crazy. When I admitted that I hadn't done much that would qualify as wild, he scoffed and said, "Oh, you're one of those girls." I felt a twinge of embarrassment and annoyance. One of those girls? What was that supposed to mean? But before I could answer, he waved over the server and ordered another round of drinks. He downed his glass and leaned back, crossing his arms. "Let's play a game," he said, eyes gleaming in a way that made me nervous. He wanted to play Never Have I Ever, and despite my instincts screaming abort mission, I agreed, figuring it couldn't hurt. The game started off mildly, but quickly escalated into Never Have I Ever Lied to Someone to Sleep with Them, and Never Have I Ever Cheated on Someone. He kept raising his glass, grinning at me as he took sip after sip, practically bragging about each confession. I felt my stomach turn, realizing he was telling me all of this not just because he thought it was fun, but because he thought it would impress me. Like he was daring me to be okay with his history of recklessness. Finally, after one too many sips and confessions, he leaned in close, smelling like wine and self-satisfaction, and said, "You know, you could use a little danger in your life. I'm a pretty good bad influence." I laughed awkwardly, trying to mask my discomfort, but his words hung heavy in the air. The rest of the night became a blur of him talking and me nodding, just waiting for the moment I could make my escape. As soon as the check came, I told him I had an early morning and had to leave. He seemed unfazed, flashing me that grin and saying, "You'll thank me later." I left the restaurant and got into an Uber, breathing a sigh of relief as I looked back at him standing there, watching me leave like he'd just done me some kind of favor. The next day, he texted me with a casual, "Had fun last night. Let's do it again sometime." I left it on read, knowing I'd dodged a bullet. Dating was exhausting enough without dealing with wannabe rebels with overblown egos. As I scrolled back through his messages, I realized I'd rather have stayed in with a bad movie and takeout. Sometimes all the red flags just wave themselves. It was the last night of a summer music festival, one of those endless nights where reality seemed to blur into the pounding bass and neon lights. I was there with two friends, David and Claire, a couple who'd been together since high school, and Claire's mom, Lydia. Lydia was one of those moms who everyone kind of knew was cool, but way too involved, like the kind who came to all the parties, drank with us, and danced with zero shame. It wasn't my scene, but that night, it felt like the whole world was leaning in close, inviting me to forget everything and just exist. At some point, Claire started feeling nauseous and asked David to take her back to the campsite. I offered to go with, but Lydia said I should stay with her. "It's the last night," she smiled, pouring us both another drink. We toasted, and I tried to ignore the way she'd been looking at me all night, like I was more than just her daughter's friend. We danced under the pulsing lights, and it felt like some weird fever dream. A little while later, Lydia took my hand, leading me through the crowd, and before I knew it, we were outside under a sky full of stars, away from the festival noise. We ended up back at the tent I was sharing with David. The minute the tent flap closed, she was on me, her hands moving with a confidence I'd only imagined from women in movies. I didn't resist. I was just a passenger in that moment, too far gone to think of anything beyond the here and now. Afterward, we lay there in a haze. I was barely coherent, but then the tent's zipper opened. I felt her freeze beside me, and then I looked up, right into Claire's face. I'll never forget her expression, the shock, the hurt, the disbelief. She didn't say anything, just backed out of the tent slowly, leaving us in a tense silence. The next morning, the sun was brutal as it lit up every corner of the campsite. David and Claire avoided me completely, and Lydia barely made eye contact. I wanted to apologize, explain something, but every time I got near her, Claire's face from the night before flashed in my mind. We packed up, the whole group in silence, and left in separate cars. I knew I'd screwed up, big time, but somehow it didn't end there. Lydia started texting me. At first, she said she wanted to clear the air. Then it was invites to grab a coffee or hang out. Against every bit of common sense I had left, I went. What started as apologies and awkward laughs over coffee spiraled into late nights at her house. A growing secret that weighed on me every time I saw David or Claire in town. It lasted for months. Lydia was intoxicating, and I let myself believe she was just lonely, that I was somehow doing her a favor by being there. It wasn't until one day, when Claire found out through a friend who'd seen us together, that the weight of it all hit me. She confronted me in front of her house. The look on her face just about broke me. She called me every name in the book and said I'd ruined her family. And you know what? She was right. The fallout was brutal. I lost David and Claire, two of the closest friends I'd ever had, and Lydia ghosted me immediately after. In the end, I was alone with a heavy lesson learned about lines that should never be crossed. Even now, years later, when I pass by where that festival used to be, I feel a wave of regret for a night I wish I could forget. There was this story my cousin Liza told me once that left us all at the edge of our seats. She'd been living in a small town, working as a pharmacy tech, and had saved enough to finally move into her first real apartment in the city. She found a great place through a rental website that looked perfect: modern kitchen, big windows, hardwood floors. The listing even had a walkthrough video, and it was exactly what she wanted. She filled out the application, got approved quickly, and was told to pay her first month's rent and security deposit to secure the unit. Everything seemed legit. She even did a virtual walkthrough with a guy who called himself the property manager. She signed the lease and paid up. That's when things started to feel strange. The property manager had told her she couldn't pick up the keys in person because he was out of town, so he'd mail them to her. She waited, but the keys never arrived. Days passed, and whenever she called him, she'd get vague answers. "Oh, they're on their way, I'll send you a tracking number soon." When he finally sent a number, it turned out to be fake. That's when she started to feel a twinge of dread. Determined not to let herself spiral, Liza took a half day off work, drove into the city, and headed to the apartment building with her lease in hand. She went to the front desk and asked if they could help her get into her new unit. The concierge gave her a blank look. "Who did you say you rented from?" She told him the name, and he shook his head slowly. No one by that name worked there. And no, her name wasn't in their system as a new tenant either. At that moment, a woman walked by and overheard their conversation. She stopped, looking equally shocked and sympathetic, and said, "You too?" Turns out this woman, Julia, had gone through the exact same thing. Same property manager, same story about the keys in the mail. Julia had already tried reporting it to the police, who basically told her it was a civil matter and advised her to take it to small claims court. In other words, they couldn't do anything. Julia had already spent hours on the phone with banks, trying to track down the payments she'd made, but the manager was a ghost. She never got a penny back. Liza was furious. She'd lost her deposit, her first month's rent, and was standing in a building she'd thought was home, but was really just a stranger's lobby. She wasn't the only victim either. Julia told her the scam had been going on for months, targeting young people moving to the city who didn't know the area well. They never saw their money again, and the scammer had likely moved on to another city by now, leaving only disappointed tenants in his wake. For weeks after that, Liza kept thinking, how was this even allowed to happen? How could someone run off with people's hard-earned money without facing real consequences? The whole experience left her jaded about renting, and she warned everyone she knew to meet property managers in person before handing over any money. She still hadn't found another place, but that feeling of having her trust and dreams snatched out from under her was something she'd never forget. To this day, we all joke about how Liza would make the world's strictest landlord. She can barely bring herself to book a hotel room without seeing it first, let alone sign another lease. And honestly, after hearing her story, I don't blame her one bit. It started at my favorite bookstore, the one I'd visited every Saturday morning for as long as I could remember. I was half hidden in the history section, flipping through a book on forgotten landmarks when I heard a voice say, "Planning a road trip to some ghost towns?" Startled, I looked up to see a guy around my age, maybe a few years older, with a mess of curly hair and a well-worn leather jacket. He was holding a copy of Murder on the Orient Express with an amused smile. I smiled back, caught between feeling slightly annoyed and strangely charmed. "Maybe," I said, trying to play it cool, "but I've been warned that reading books about mysterious places might lead to mysterious adventures." He laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That sounds like an invitation to me," he replied, glancing down at his book. "Though, I guess I'm sticking to classic mysteries. I don't know what possessed me, but I threw back. Yeah, I could use a Watson for this adventure." He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised but intrigued. "All right, Watson it is. What are we investigating?" he asked, eyes glinting with a challenge. I felt an unexpected thrill, like I'd jumped into some inside joke we hadn't established yet. Emboldened, I motioned for him to follow as I led him to the section with the most bizarre, dusty books on abandoned places and urban legends. We ended up sitting cross-legged in the aisle, flipping through pages of haunted hotels, underground bunkers, and lost cities. As we read, we kept up this elaborate role-play, assigning ourselves tasks. Him as the detective scoping out clues, me as the seasoned investigator with a suspicious past. For hours, we shared bizarre facts like the haunting of an old mansion on the edge of town, and made wild speculations about how we'd solve the mysteries ourselves. People walked past, giving us strange looks, but neither of us cared. At one point, I caught myself laughing so hard I had to hold my side. It felt oddly freeing, like being a kid again. Finally, as the store announced it was closing, he looked at me, serious for the first time. "All right, so when's our first adventure?" I blinked, taken aback. Part of me thought this was all just for fun, that we'd go our separate ways and maybe never see each other again. But he seemed genuinely interested, his eyes hopeful, yet a little uncertain. I hesitated, half expecting to chicken out, but something about him made me bold. "Tomorrow night," I replied. "There's a ghost tour downtown, if you're brave enough." He grinned, holding out his hand. "Bravery is my middle name. I'm Dylan, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Detective Dylan," I said, shaking his hand, feeling an unexpected warmth from the contact. "I'm Leah." That night, I could barely sleep. The next day, I spent hours debating what to wear and telling myself it wasn't a big deal, that it was just a silly adventure with a stranger. But when I saw him waiting under the streetlights, looking at his watch with that same lopsided grin, I knew it was more than that. The ghost tour was cheesy, the kind where the guide makes spooky noises and shines flashlights under his chin. But with Dylan, every shadow felt a little darker, every alley a little more mysterious. We whispered, laughing quietly at the jump scares, pretending to take notes on paranormal activity, and making up ridiculous theories about the haunted locations. When the tour ended, neither of us wanted to part ways. So we wandered through the quiet streets, talking about everything and nothing. Somewhere between sharing embarrassing childhood stories and confessing that we both secretly wished for supernatural powers as kids, he took my hand. It was so casual, so easy, that it felt like it had always been meant to happen. We walked like that, hand in hand, down empty streets, as if we were the only two people in the world. When we finally reached my apartment, he hesitated, looking down at our intertwined fingers as if deciding something. "So Leah," he began, grinning, "next Saturday? The bookstore?" I nodded, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "Same time, Detective?" He smiled, giving my hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. "Same time, Watson." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me on the doorstep with a smile that lasted long after he disappeared down the street. About a month ago, I was scrolling through job boards late at night, my mind numb after a long day at work. I didn't actually need a new job. I had a stable, if somewhat uninspiring, position in a mid-sized IT firm. But I'd fallen into the habit of mindlessly browsing, checking out opportunities one knew I'd never apply for. It was just something to pass the time. That's when I saw it. Seeking night manager for remote island hotel. My finger hovered over the job listing, and I chuckled to myself. What a ridiculous thought. A night manager for an island hotel. It felt like something out of a novel, one of those jobs people take when they're trying to run away from life. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The description was minimal, almost cryptic. Manage operations and maintenance overnight. Assist guests. Maintain island grounds. Room and board included. Out of curiosity, I clicked just to read more. The listing was sparse on details. No company name, no exact location, just a line about the hotel being on an idyllic, private island with a handful of rooms and a focus on solitude and reflection. There was an email contact and, on impulse, I decided to write to them, asking for more information. I didn't expect a response, but the very next morning, there it was in my inbox. A short, professional message from someone named L, thanking me for my interest and offering a time for a video interview that very afternoon. Curiosity had me hooked. I replied immediately, scheduling the call. When the time came, I logged into the video chat to see a woman with silvery hair in a warm, cozy room, smiling at me from the screen. "Thank you for reaching out," she said, her voice gentle but authoritative. She explained the position in more detail. The hotel was indeed small, more of a retreat center, really, with just a few rooms and a handful of staff. They needed someone who could be on call overnight for the guests, attend to any maintenance issues, and be a steady, comforting presence. No corporate jargon, no flashy promises, just a simple role in a place designed to help people reconnect with themselves. "It's quite remote," she warned. "It's not for everyone." Against my own better judgment, I heard myself saying, "I think I'd like to try." 2 weeks later, I was on a tiny seaplane, flying out to an island I couldn't even find on Google Maps. I'd given notice of my job, packed up my apartment, and told my friends I was taking a break from everything for a while. No one could understand it, but something inside me told me this was what I needed: a clean break, a complete shift. The island itself was breathtaking. Crystal clear waters, dense forest, and a single winding path that led to a beautiful old house that served as the hotel. It was a place straight out of a dream. There were only 4 other people working there, all of them quiet, unassuming, each somehow as mysterious as the next. During the day, I learned my responsibilities: checking on the generators, making sure the guests had what they needed, tidying up common spaces, and doing light repairs. Nights, though, were another story. On my first night shift, Elle handed me a heavy ring of keys, smiled, and said, "The island is yours tonight." I had no idea how serious she was being until I started walking around. There was a strange calm at night. The moon would hang low over the water, illuminating the path around the hotel grounds. At midnight, after I'd made sure all the guests were settled, I walked down to the beach and looked out at the horizon. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness I hadn't felt in years. It was absolute solitude, and for a moment, I felt like I was the only person on Earth. Each night, I fell a little deeper into the silence of that place. I took to walking the paths in the woods, checking the little cabins scattered around the property. I started leaving my phone in my room, letting go of that constant need to check it. I would sit by the water's edge until dawn, breathing in the salt air and letting my mind drift. One night, as I was making my rounds, I noticed something odd. There was a light on in one of the older cabins that I hadn't seen anyone use since I arrived. It was on the far side of the island, a bit off the main path. I decided to investigate. Inside, there was an old man sitting by a fireplace, writing in a journal. He looked up as I entered, surprised but not alarmed. He nodded at me, gesturing for me to sit down. "I used to work here too," he said, as if he'd been waiting to tell me this. He was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. "You know, this place has a way of showing you things about yourself you didn't know you were missing." I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. He went on to tell me about his life, a life not unlike mine, a series of obligations, of things done out of routine and habit. He'd come to the island years ago, intending to stay for a month and then move on. But something about it had captivated him, and he'd spent years here, until he felt he was ready to return to the world with a new perspective. "You don't have to stay forever," he said, giving me a small smile. "Just stay long enough to understand why you came." After he left, I never saw him again. In fact, no one else at the hotel seemed to know anything about him, as if he was a ghost of the island's past. But his words stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a routine of solitude. I took long walks, read every book I could get my hands on, and even began keeping a journal of my own. There were days when I'd wake up with the sun and realize that I didn't feel the same restlessness I used to. Somehow, the questions that used to haunt me didn't seem as pressing here. I'd spend hours watching the waves crash, feeling like each one was washing away a piece of that life I'd left behind. I started thinking less about what I should be doing and more about what I wanted to be doing. There was no pressure here, no rush, just time to be alone, to reflect, to really see myself for the first time in years. One morning, just before dawn, I walked down to the shore, watching as the sky lightened over the water. I felt a sense of peace I'd never known before. I realized then that my life would never quite be the same, no matter where I ended up next. The island had given me something I hadn't known I was missing, a glimpse of who I was when no one else was watching, a version of myself stripped down to the essentials. I knew I'd eventually return to my old life, but it would be different now. I would be different. I didn't leave the island with answers. Instead, I left with questions, the kind of questions that don't need immediate answers, the ones that keep you exploring, keep you wondering. And every so often, when life gets overwhelming, I think back to that little cabin and the old man by the fire, and remember that sometimes the best journeys are the ones that lead us back to ourselves. I met him freshman year of college. From day one, he was the kind of friend who made life feel like an adventure, easygoing, full of wild stories and hilarious ideas for late-night escapades. By sophomore year, we were practically inseparable, and there was never a hint of romance. People assumed otherwise, but we'd always laugh it off. Sure, he was ridiculously good-looking, but to me, he was just him, my best friend, my partner in crime, the person who saw through my sarcastic walls and somehow found it endearing. One night, though, everything changed. It was the end of the semester, and we were celebrating with a bunch of friends, though most had trickled out by midnight. As usual, he and I stuck around, talking about everything from our shared love of 90s rock to his most recent disastrous dating attempt. Somewhere between the last beer and a random karaoke duet, he looked at me, and I realized something had shifted. His gaze lingered just a second too long, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was seeing me differently too. We didn't talk about it. Instead, we decided to walk around campus. It was freezing, and he gave me his jacket, which only made things more surreal. We walked in comfortable silence until we found ourselves at a park bench by the pond, the place we used to come to talk about life and vent about finals. This time, though, there was no talk. He just pulled me close, gently tucking my hair behind my ear, and I knew. When he kissed me, it felt like the beginning and end of something I couldn't quite put into words. The next morning, I woke up with him beside me, and panic hit me like a tidal wave. He opened his eyes, smiled that sleepy, crooked smile of his, and for a moment, I thought everything would be okay. But as the weeks went on, it became clear that neither of us knew what to do with whatever was happening between us. We both tried to act normal, kept things casual, but we weren't fooling anyone, least of all ourselves. Every touch, every look, there was always something unspoken, a question hanging in the air. After a few months of this limbo, he started dating someone. I put on a brave face, told him I was happy for him, but inside, it felt like a punch to the gut. The worst part was, we still hung out all the time. She was nice enough, but I couldn't help but resent her a little, even though she didn't know. I watched them laugh together, noticed how he'd do little things like open doors for her, and it was like reliving that night over and over, only with me on the outside. Our friendship grew strained. I'd make excuses to skip our usual movie nights or group outings, and he'd always give me that confused look, like he didn't understand why things had changed. One night, after a particularly brutal argument over something completely trivial, I finally snapped. "You act like nothing's different," I said, words tumbling out before I could stop them. But it is, and I don't know how to keep pretending it's not. He looked at me, a flicker of realization crossing his face. And for a moment, I thought he'd say something, anything, to make it better. But he just looked away, running a hand through his hair, and muttered, "I thought we were just friends." I laughed, but it came out more like a sob. "Maybe that's the problem," I said. "Maybe we were never just friends." After that, we drifted apart. It hurt like hell, but part of me felt relieved. At least I didn't have to keep wondering, keep hoping. I tried to move on, dated a couple of people, tried to forget the sound of his laugh, the way he'd roll his eyes at my bad jokes. But every now and then, something would remind me of him, and I'd feel that pang of regret all over again. Years passed, and I eventually moved to another city. Life moved on. Then one day, out of the blue, I got a message from him. He'd heard from a mutual friend that I was back in town for a few days and wanted to catch up. My heart skipped a beat, and against my better judgment, I agreed. When I saw him again, it was like no time had passed. He looked the same, maybe a little older, a little wiser, but still him. We talked about everything and nothing like we always had, but there was an edge to it now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. I wanted to ask him why he'd reached out, but I didn't have to. As we walked along the same path we'd once wandered so many times before, he stopped and turned to me. "I've thought about that night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "More times than I can count." I felt my heart in my throat as he looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "I was scared," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Scared of losing you, scared of screwing it all up. But I never stopped regretting letting you go." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. We stood there in silence, letting the years of pain and confusion melt away. It felt like we were finally letting go of the past, making room for whatever was supposed to come next. Now we're together, and it's not the same as it was, but maybe that's okay. We're older, a little scarred, but somehow it makes everything feel deeper, more real. It's not the fairy tale I once imagined, but it's ours. And for the first time, I think that's enough. I met Chris at a friend's wedding, which felt like a promising start, given that weddings are supposed to be all about love and happy endings. He was the best man, and when he gave his speech, he had everyone laughing and tearing up at the same time. I figured anyone who could make strangers feel that way had to be worth knowing. We talked a bit at the reception, and he was warm and engaging, with just the right amount of self-deprecating humor to keep things fun. By the end of the night, he'd asked for my number, and I left thinking, wow, maybe this is one of those meet-cute stories you tell your kids someday. A few days later, he invited me out for dinner, and I was excited. I mean, how could a guy who nailed his best man speech possibly go wrong? We agreed to meet at a popular Italian spot, and as soon as I saw him waiting by the entrance, I felt those butterflies again. He looked great, smiled wide, and gave me a warm hug. So far, so good. We sat down, ordered a bottle of wine, and started chatting. For the first 20 minutes, everything was smooth. He talked about his work in graphic design, his latest obsession with some obscure British sitcom, and even shared a funny story about his cat's aggressive love for cardboard boxes. He was charming, attentive, and just the right mix of funny and thoughtful. I felt myself easing into the date, thinking this could be something real. But then, halfway through the main course, things took a turn. Out of nowhere, he asked, "So, what are your thoughts on government surveillance?" I blinked mid-bite, not sure if he was joking. But his face was dead serious. I mumbled something non-committal, trying to keep it light, but he was off and running. What followed was a full-blown monologue about every conspiracy theory you could imagine. He didn't even stop to take a breath. In a matter of minutes, Chris had somehow shifted from government surveillance to how the moon landing was faked to secret societies controlling the world. I sat there, trapped between my carbonara and his unrelenting lecture on the truth behind the pyramids, nodding politely and praying he'd run out of steam. But every time I thought he'd finally paused, he'd take a sip of wine, lean forward and say, "And another thing they don't want you to know." At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I tried to change the subject, asking if he'd seen any good movies lately. He gave me a blank stare and then replied, "Hollywood's part of the machine." He then launched into a diatribe about how movie stars are just puppets for the government and subliminal messages in Disney movies. I was so close to bursting out laughing, but he was so intense about it, so deeply convinced that I was almost afraid to break the spell. As dessert arrived, he finally asked me a question. So, do you believe in aliens? I considered lying just to get through the night, but curiosity got the better of me. So I shrugged and said, I guess it's possible? He looked thrilled, like I'd just passed some secret test. He went on about how he'd seen a UFO once when he was camping, convinced it was proof of extraterrestrial life, and how he thought his cat, yes, his cat, was somehow communicating with him. By this point, I was half amused, half horrified. I figured I could either sit there, indulging this strange detour into his conspiracy-filled mind, or find an excuse to leave. But just as I was about to concoct an exit strategy, he leaned in, his eyes wide with excitement, and whispered, Listen, there's something I want to show you. Against my better judgment, I followed him out of the restaurant to his car, where he opened the trunk and pulled out a huge binder labeled Classified Information. Inside were pages and pages of newspaper clippings, photos of mysterious lights, grainy images of supposed alien markings, and handwritten notes in the margins. He pointed out specific passages, growing more animated with each proof he showed me, while I stood there, glancing around the parking lot, praying no one was watching me in what felt like a scene from some B-movie thriller. When he finally looked up, his eyes gleaming with a kind of manic pride, he said, So, are you ready to wake up to the truth? I was speechless, a mix of bewildered and, frankly, a little terrified. My brain scrambled for a polite way to respond, but all I managed was a weak, Wow, that's a lot. I finally pulled the early morning card and thanked him for dinner, inching my way toward the exit while he stood there, looking both proud and slightly disappointed. As I walked to my car, he called out, Think about what I said. Don't let them keep you in the dark. I waved awkwardly, got in, and drove off, laughing hysterically once I was a safe distance away. When I got home, there was a text from him. Had an amazing time. Let's meet again soon. I'll show you more of my research. I didn't respond. The next day, I blocked his number, deleted his contact, and shared the story with my friends over drinks. We laughed until we cried, but deep down, I felt a little pang of sadness. It was like a sign that dating was now some surreal minefield, where beneath a charming smile and a good first impression, you never knew when you'd stumble on something so bizarre that even the best red flag radar couldn't prepare. Sometimes, the best things happen when you don't see them coming at all. For me, it started with a wrong number. It was a rainy Tuesday, and I was sitting on my couch, half watching a reality show and half answering work emails on my phone. I'd had one of those exhausting days where you're not really sure what you accomplished, and all I wanted was to zone out. Then, out of the blue, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Hey, let's confirm for Friday at 7. Don't forget to bring the cake. At first, I thought it was spam, so I ignored it. But about an hour later, the same number texted again, this time with a panic follow-up. Also, can you please check on the decorations? We don't want a repeat of last year grinning face with sweat. I figured someone was definitely texting the wrong person, so I wrote back, Hey, I think you have the wrong number. Good luck with your party. I thought that would be the end of it. But they replied immediately. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I thought this was Tina. I'm just so stressed about this birthday party. My sister's turning 30, and I'm in way over my head with planning. Now, I'm the type of person who can't resist a good party. I love planning events, from picking out napkin colors to deciding on a playlist. So, almost instinctively, I texted back. If it makes you feel better, I'm a party planning enthusiast. Maybe I can help. Within minutes, I was on the phone with wrong number, who introduced herself as Jess. We hit it off right away, laughing about how she'd accidentally roped a stranger into planning her sister's party. She explained that she'd been swamped at work, barely able to keep up with her day job, let alone plan an Instagram-worthy party. Jess sounded so overwhelmed, and without thinking twice, I offered to meet her the next day to go over her plans and help her make a to-do list. It was one of those spontaneous decisions you can't really explain, but the next day, there I was in a coffee shop, sitting across from a woman I'd never met, scribbling down ideas for her sister's party. Jess had already booked a small venue and had a vague idea of a vintage glamour theme, but that was about it. By the time we finished our coffee, I had her set up with a color scheme, ideas for table centerpieces, and a list of local vendors who could pull it all together. I even volunteered to go with her to pick out decorations later that week, which seemed to put her at ease. Friday came, and I met Jess at the venue to help set up. She was so grateful that she introduced me to everyone as her co-party planner. And at one point, her sister pulled me aside and thanked me for helping make her birthday the most special night of her life. The whole event was beautiful, from the fairy lights and vintage accents to the guests dressed in glamorous, roaring 20s outfits. By the end of the night, people were asking for my contact information, saying, "I heard you're a party planner. Can you do something like this for my anniversary? My office party? My friend's baby shower?" I laughed and told them I was actually a project manager for a tech company, not a professional party planner, but they just shrugged and asked for my number anyway. By the time I left the venue, I had more business cards and party requests than I knew what to do with. Jess hugged me tight and said, "I don't know how I would have done this without you. You really have a gift, you know?" That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Here I was, the accidental party planner, suddenly being encouraged to take my knack for planning from a hobby to something more. I'd always loved organizing and decorating for friends' events, and I'd had endless Pinterest boards dedicated to different party themes. But the idea of doing it as a career? That felt too far-fetched, like one of those wild dreams you have that you're too afraid to take seriously. But something about that night stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I started experimenting. I created an Instagram page called Parties by Chance, a nod to my completely accidental start in the business, and posted photos of Jess's sister's party, along with pictures from other events I'd helped friends with over the years. I wrote short captions, explaining the theme and little tips for how to make parties feel personalized. To my surprise, the account picked up followers almost immediately. People were commenting, messaging, and even emailing me about potential events. Within a month, I had my first paying client, a woman who wanted a garden-themed engagement party. She told me she'd been following my Instagram and loved my fresh and inviting aesthetic. I was both thrilled and nervous. I poured everything I had into that engagement party, transforming the backyard into a romantic flower-strewn haven. I crafted handmade signs, built a photo booth out of hanging plants and fairy lights, and created little love quotes on tiny cards scattered across the tables. By the end of the night, the couple was in tears, thanking me for making their day so beautiful. And with that, Parties by Chance took off. Word spread faster than I could have imagined. Over the next few months, I started getting requests for all kinds of events: birthday parties, corporate gatherings, and even a small wedding. I rented a storage unit to hold decorations and supplies, stocked up on everything from tea lights to linens, and even hired a couple of part-time helpers for the bigger events. It was exhilarating and exhausting, but every event left me feeling more fulfilled than anything I'd done in my corporate job. Eventually, I took the leap and quit my job to focus on party planning full-time. It was terrifying, but I'd built up a steady stream of clients, and my calendar was booked months in advance. I even started a small blog on my website, sharing DIY ideas and behind-the-scenes stories from my events, and I quickly gained a community of people who loved everything about celebrating life's moments, big and small. A year after that fateful wrong number text, I received a message from Jess. She was getting married, and she wanted me to plan the wedding. "I need the person who got me through my sister's 30th to handle the most important day of my life," she said. I was touched and a little stunned. As I walked her through the initial stages of planning, I couldn't help but think back to that rainy night on my couch when all of this felt impossible. Parties by Chance is still going strong, and every event is a reminder of the strange, wonderful chain of events that brought me here. Sometimes I think back to that wrong number text and laugh, wondering what I'd be doing if I hadn't answered. But I'm glad I did, because it led me here to a career I love, born entirely by accident, out of a simple willingness to help a stranger with a party. Now, I always keep my phone close because you never know when an unexpected message might change your life. A friend of mine, Maria, has this story that she tells whenever someone brings up shady business practices. It's both hilarious and infuriating, and it starts with something innocent enough: a pair of concert tickets. Maria and her boyfriend had been dying to see their favorite band for years, and finally, they were coming to town. She got online right at the second tickets went live, even had an alarm set. The queue was massive, and by the time she made it through, only the most expensive VIP packages were left. It was either pay triple the regular price or miss out. They bit the bullet, swiped their credit card, and figured it was worth it. Then, a week before the concert, they received a text from the venue. "Congratulations! You're one of the lucky fans to get a free VIP upgrade for the show." Maria was thrilled, thinking they'd get some cool merch or a meet and greet. But when they got to the venue, the whole thing turned into a nightmare. Their tickets had been upgraded all right. Only now, they were stuck in a section far from the stage, squished in a crowd of people who'd received the same upgrade. Instead of the front row seats they'd paid for, they were back near the food stands, watching their favorite band perform on a screen. Furious, she stormed to the ticket counter, only to be met with blank stares and mumbled apologies. "It's just the policy," they kept saying. They'd overbooked the front rows, and upgrading people to a farther spot was apparently their way of handling it. After the concert, she decided to get to the bottom of it. She dug through forums, read dozens of complaints, and learned that this upgrade trick was becoming a common tactic. The venue would oversell prime seats and then relocate fans who'd paid for those seats, banking on the idea that most people wouldn't make a fuss. To add insult to injury, the venue had made a small fortune by reselling those original seats multiple times, turning loyal fans into nothing more than walking dollar signs. Maria filed complaint after complaint, but each response was a dead end. The ticket company blamed the venue pointed at the band's management, and the management didn't respond at all. In the end, her only option was to post a scathing review, warning future concert-goers of the scam. She joked that she'd spent more time attending her complaints than she did actually seeing the concert. We laugh about it now, but it's become her personal motto. Anytime she's debating whether to splurge on an event, she mutters, "Is this another VIP upgrade situation?" It's funny how a simple concert turned her into a ticket-buying skeptic, and now she makes sure everyone she knows double-checks the fine print before buying tickets for anything. For Maria, it's not just about getting ripped off. It's about never letting anyone turn her excitement into a profit machine again. I'll never forget that first night in the club, mostly because it started off as a total disaster. I convinced myself I could handle the nerves. "Just act like you own the place," my friend kept telling me. She was the reason I was even here in the first place. She'd been dancing for years and had finally managed to talk me into giving it a try after my umpteenth rant about my awful waitressing job. When I arrived, the place was already buzzing. The neon lights, the loud music, the smell of cheap cologne and perfume. It was overwhelming. The other dancers were in the back, getting ready, applying makeup with the precision of surgeons. I was clutching my heels so tightly my knuckles turned white. They had shown me around earlier, giving me a rundown of the stage and the rules, but it was all a blur now. My friend helped me with my makeup, gave me one last pep talk, and then it was time to go out. They called my name. It felt like everything stopped, and it was just me standing there about to walk into the spotlight. I took a deep breath, forced a smile, and stepped out onto the stage. The lights hit me, and immediately I realized I'd completely forgotten every move I had practiced. I just stood there frozen, my mind blank. The crowd was looking up at me, waiting. I could feel the panic bubbling up, so I did the only thing I could think of. I laughed. I guess it was the unexpectedness of it, but the audience actually laughed back. Someone shouted, "Take it off!" And somehow, that snapped me back to reality. I remembered the basic moves my friend had taught me, and I just started swaying, slowly finding a rhythm. I focused on one of the lights above the crowd, pretending it was just me in my room, like I practiced. My movements were shaky, nowhere near the polished routines of the other dancers, but the crowd didn't seem to mind. They started cheering, throwing tips onto the stage. Each dollar that hit the floor boosted my confidence just a little bit. About halfway through, I spotted a guy near the front who was watching me with this huge, goofy smile on his face. He didn't look like the regulars. He seemed more like he'd gotten dragged here by friends. When our eyes met, he cheered and gave me a thumbs up, mouthing, "You're doing great." That simple gesture of encouragement made me feel 10 feet tall. I shot him a wink, and suddenly, I was having fun. I wasn't just stumbling through this. I was actually enjoying it. After my set, I went back to the dressing room, feeling like I'd run a marathon. My friend was waiting with this huge grin on her face, practically bouncing with excitement. "See? I told you you'd kill it," she said, hugging me. I felt this strange mix of pride and relief, like I'd conquered something big. The night didn't end there, though. There was one more curveball waiting for me. Towards the end of the shift, one of the regulars, this older guy who the other dancers referred to as Mr. Big Spender, asked me to join him for a private dance. My friend had warned me about him. He was harmless but known for being a bit intense. Still riding the high from my set, I figured I could handle it, so I agreed. In the private room, I was nervous again, but Mr. Big Spender turned out to be a lot less intimidating than I'd expected. He was talkative, asking me questions about my life like he was genuinely interested. We ended up chatting for a while, and at one point, he even started telling me about his own daughter who was around my age. It felt almost surreal, like I was just having a normal conversation with a regular customer, not doing something totally out of my comfort zone. When the dance was over, he handed me a crisp $100 bill, smiled, and said, "You're going to do great here, kid." Walking out of the club that night, my head was buzzing. It wasn't just about the money, although that was more than I'd ever made in one night waiting tables. It was something else, this feeling that I'd taken a huge leap, done something that scared me to my core, and survived. I felt like I was finally in control of something in my life. That night was the beginning of a wild journey. There were ups and downs, good nights and bad, but that feeling of empowerment, of pushing through fear and finding my footing, has stuck with me ever since. It was one of those impulsive nights that start with no plan, just a few text messages exchanged and a vague "let's go out." By the time I met up with my friends, the night was already unfolding in a way that felt unpredictable and electric. We ended up at a rooftop bar downtown, the kind of place where you can see the city lights stretched out like stars, and the music mixes with laughter and shouts from strangers sharing the same high of a Friday night. After a few rounds, I spotted him leaning against the railing, looking out over the city with an ease that was intriguing. He had a look about him, scruffy, a little unpolished, but in a deliberate way that felt real. And when he caught me staring, he didn't look away. Instead, he raised his drink and grinned. I felt a flush of excitement, that familiar buzz of possibility mixed with a healthy dose of caution. Within minutes, we drifted toward each other, the unspoken pull that sometimes happens between strangers. His name was Jake, and his voice had this low, calm quality that made everything he said feel like a secret. We traded stories, ridiculous ones, half-truths we both knew were probably embellished, but neither of us cared. It felt like a game, charming each other, testing boundaries without saying too much. I barely noticed my friends had faded into the background. It was just us, standing close in a bubble of laughter and glances that lingered a little too long. When he suggested we go somewhere quieter, I hesitated, every rational part of me reminding me that this was a stranger, that I didn't know this night to anyone but myself. But the night was warm, and I was curious, craving that feeling of doing something just because it felt right in the moment. We found ourselves walking along the quiet streets away from the bar, the noise and lights fading into the background as we settled into a rhythm, talking about anything and nothing. There was something in the way he listened, nodding thoughtfully, making me feel like every word I said mattered. The world felt suspended around us, and I realized I hadn't felt this free in a long time. Eventually, we reached a tiny, late-night cafe, the kind with dim lighting and mismatched chairs. We grabbed a booth, leaning close over steaming mugs of coffee. We talked about travel, our favorite books, stories from childhood, and every topic felt like an invitation, an open door we both stepped through, willingly, recklessly. There was a comfort to it, a weird intimacy that felt like we'd known each other for longer than a few hours. The cafe closed, and we were the last to leave, wandering back toward his place, the night air cool against my skin. When he reached for my hand, it was like the final unspoken signal, and we didn't say a word as we walked together. His apartment was quiet, dark, filled with the comfortable clutter of someone who doesn't mind a little chaos. We laughed our way to his bedroom, both of us just drunk enough on the night to let ourselves sink into the moment without thinking ahead. The hours passed in a blur of closeness, murmured words and laughter, the kind that felt vulnerable and exhilarating all at once. I felt like I was on a tightrope between excitement and something deeper, something unfamiliar and a little unsettling. But by morning, everything felt different. I woke up to the sunlight streaming through the blinds, stark and unfiltered, illuminating the reality that had been hazy in the dark. Jake was still asleep, his arm draped over me, his breathing steady. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, a familiar unease settling in. I had been here before, caught between the magic of a night that felt like it could be more and the knowledge that it probably wasn't. I slipped out of bed carefully, grabbing my clothes and tiptoeing out, hoping to make my escape without shattering the delicate bubble of the night before. But as I reached the door, I heard him stir and turned to see him watching me, his gaze curious but understanding. He gave a small smile, a silent acknowledgement, and I felt an odd pang of both relief and sadness. I left, my mind a storm of emotions that refused to settle. I knew I had enjoyed the night, the adventure, the thrill of letting go. But in the light of day, it felt incomplete, a taste of something I couldn't hold on to. The walk home was quiet, the world waking up around me, and I felt both exhilarated and strangely empty, like I had reached for something that dissolved the moment I tried to grasp it. For days, I replayed the night in my mind, not just the details, but the way it had made me feel. I realized that as much as I loved the freedom of it all, part of me had hoped for something more, something beyond the night. I started to wonder if I had been using these encounters to fill a space inside me that wasn't meant for temporary thrills, but for something lasting, something real. That night didn't leave me with regret, but with a new clarity. I saw that while these moments of spontaneity were exciting, they weren't the answer I was looking for. They gave me a glimpse into a world where connection could be instant, electric, but ultimately fleeting. I craved something deeper, a connection that wouldn't dissolve in the harsh light of morning. And so I've moved forward differently since then, open to adventure, but grounded in a new understanding of what I truly want. That night with Jake taught me that while passion and freedom are intoxicating, they're not the whole picture. It's the moments that last beyond a single night, the ones that feel just as strong in the daylight, that I now see. The call came just after midnight, jolting me out of a restless sleep. It was that hour where you know a call is never good news. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, squinting at the screen. It was Dad. I hadn't heard from him in months. Not because we didn't talk. We did sporadically, in the awkward way you talk to someone you're supposed to know, but don't really anymore. But because he never called in the middle of the night. I picked up, bracing myself for whatever I was about to hear. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" There was a pause, then his voice crackling over the line. "Your grandma, she's not doing too well. The doctor says it's probably time for you to come home." The words hit me like a fist to the chest. My grandmother had been my constant, the one solid, unshakable thing in a life that had spun every which way over the years. I hadn't been home since I'd left for college and moved to the city, burying myself in work and friends, and the endless noise that kept me from thinking too hard about what I'd left behind. "I'll be there tomorrow," I said, the words feeling heavy, final. The flight was only a few hours, but it felt like an eternity. I stared out the window as the plane sliced through clouds, feeling an ache settle in my bones, a restless yearning to turn back time, to freeze things before they unraveled. By the time I landed and made my way to the small town where I'd grown up, it was nearly dusk. The house looked smaller than I remembered. It sat at the end of a winding road, its faded paint peeling under the late afternoon sun. I hadn't been here in so long that it almost didn't feel real. But as soon as I walked through the door, the smell of lavender and lemon hit me, and I was pulled back to my childhood, to summer afternoons spent baking cookies with Grandma, to nights spent curled up on the couch, listening to her tell stories of her own youth. Dad met me at the door, his face worn, his eyes heavy with the kind of sadness that words can't touch. He didn't say much, just gave me a quick hug and led me down the narrow hallway to her room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see her lying in bed, her thin frame almost swallowed by the blankets. She looked smaller, frilier than I'd ever seen her, her once bright eyes dimmed by time and weariness. I stood in the doorway, feeling a lump rise in my throat. She looked up, her gaze meeting mine, and for a moment, her face lit up with a faint, familiar smile. "Is that my little troublemaker?" she murmured, her voice raspy but warm. I laughed softly, stepping into the room and taking her hand. Her skin was paper-thin, cool to the touch, and I held it gently, afraid that too much pressure would somehow hurt her. "It's me, Grandma," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here." She gave my hand a gentle squeeze, her eyes drifting closed as if even this small effort was too much. I sat by her side, the silence thick and comforting, like a blanket wrapping around us. I didn't know what to say, and it didn't feel like there was anything that needed to be said. We'd shared a lifetime of memories, and in that moment, it felt like they were all coming back to me, flooding my mind like waves on a shore. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, whispered conversations, and late nights spent by her side. She was slipping away slowly, like sand through a sieve, and all I could do was sit there, holding her hand, watching her fade. I found myself wandering through the house at odd hours, tracing my fingers over the worn furniture, the old photographs lining the walls. Each object held a memory, a fragment of a life that was slowly being erased. One evening, as I was going through a box of old letters in the attic, I found a worn, yellowed envelope with my name scrawled on it in Grandma's handwriting. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, unfolding the letter inside. It was dated years ago, back when I was just a kid. "My dearest," it began, "I don't know if I'll be around to see the person you'll become, but I want you to know that you are loved, more than words can say. Life will be hard sometimes, harder than you think you can bear. But you have a strength inside you, a light that can carry you through even the darkest moments." I blinked back tears as I read her words, feeling her presence beside me, as if she were right there, whispering them into my ear. I sat there, clutching the letter to my chest, feeling the weight of all the years I'd been away, all the time I'd let slip through my fingers. That night, I returned to her room, my heart heavy with the knowledge that our time together was slipping away. She was awake, her eyes bright with a clarity I hadn't seen in days. She looked at me, her gaze soft, understanding. "Did you find the letter?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. I nodded, unable to speak. She smiled a faint, knowing smile. "I wanted you to have something to hold on to when I'm gone," she murmured. "Something to remind you of who you are, where you come from." I leaned over, pressing a kiss to her forehead, feeling the warmth of her skin against my lips. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice breaking. "For everything." In the days that followed, her strength waned, her breaths coming slower, more labored. We stayed by her side, my father and I, taking turns holding her hand, whispering words of comfort, even though we knew she was slipping further away with each passing moment. Then, one quiet morning, as the first rays of dawn broke through the window, she took her last breath. It was so soft, so gentle, that it took me a moment to realize she was gone. I sat there, frozen, watching her face relax, her body settle into stillness, as if she had finally found peace. The house felt emptier after she was gone, like her spirit had been woven into its very walls, and now, with her passing, the threads were coming undone. I walked through each room one last time, letting my fingers brush against the furniture, the walls, the small trinkets she'd collected over the years. Each object was a memory, a reminder of the woman who had been the heart and soul of our family. When it was time to leave, I folded her letter carefully, tucking it into my pocket, feeling its weight, its warmth, as if it were a part of her that I could carry with me. I looked back one last time, taking in the house, the memories, the life she had built. And as I walked away, I felt a quiet resolve settle over me, a promise to carry her memory forward, to live in a way that would make her proud. The world felt a little colder, a little emptier without her. But as I held her letter close to my heart, I felt a flicker of warmth, a gentle reminder that she would always be with me, in the spaces between memories, in the quiet moments, in the love she had given so freely. The laundromat was the last place I expected to find anyone interesting. I dragged myself there on a cold, rainy Sunday evening with a pile of laundry so big it looked like it might swallow me whole. As I was dumping clothes into the machine, I noticed a guy struggling with a jam machine across from me. His defeated sigh caught my attention, and without thinking, I blurted out, "Do you need a hand with that?" He looked up surprised but grateful. "Thanks. This machine hates me," he said with a half smile. I showed him a trick my mom had taught me, just a gentle smack on the top to loosen the latch. And miraculously it worked. He laughed, a warm, hearty sound that made the dreary laundromat feel just a bit cozier. "Clearly, you're a pro at this," he said, flashing me a grin. "I'm Nathan, by the way." I introduced myself, suddenly aware that I was wearing mismatched socks and an oversized sweatshirt. But he didn't seem to notice. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, not sure if the conversation would end there or keep going. Then he gestured to the worn-out chairs by the dryers. "Since we're stuck here for a while, care to join me?" We sat down, and as our clothes tumbled and whirled in the machines, we started talking. Small talk at first, complaints about the weather, the lack of good takeout nearby, the absurdity of adult chores like laundry. But soon, we found ourselves diving deeper, sharing stories of terrible first jobs, strange family traditions, and the best road trips we'd ever taken. At one point, he pointed out my book, which I'd thrown into my laundry basket. "Are you really reading Pride and Prejudice?" he asked, eyebrows raised in amusement. "Yes, don't judge," I said, feeling a little embarrassed. But he just grinned wider. "No judgment at all. I'm actually a fan. The Mr. Darcy transformation arc is classic." I was shocked, not expecting him to know or care about the story. This led to a hilarious and surprisingly heated debate over which Jane Austen adaptation was the best, complete with dramatic impressions of Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth. As the dryers rumbled around us, I found myself forgetting about the damp weather and the dreary laundromat entirely. There was something so unpretentious about it all. No fancy outfits, no forced small talk, just two strangers killing time and genuinely enjoying each other's company. When his clothes finally finished drying, he gave me a sheepish look. "All right, my laundry's done," but he hesitated, clearly debating something. Then he took a deep breath and continued, "I know this is unconventional, but would you maybe want to continue this conversation over coffee?" "It's on me," I agreed, trying to play it cool, but my heart was doing backflips. We stuffed our clean clothes haphazardly back into our baskets and, laughing at the ridiculousness of it all, headed out into the rainy night. We found a tiny, warm cafe just a few blocks away. We sat by the window with 2 mugs of hot coffee, watching the rain drip down outside as we continued talking like old friends. Every now and then, he'd make me laugh so hard I almost spilled my drink, and I noticed how his eyes crinkled when he smiled, a detail I'd somehow missed in the laundromat. Hours later, as the cafe started to close, he walked me back to my car, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Before we parted, he looked at me a little shyly and said, "You know, of all the places to meet someone, I never thought it'd be over a broken washing machine." I laughed, feeling a warmth spread through me despite the cold. "Guess life's funny like that." He held out his phone, grinning. "Maybe we should make a tradition of it. Weekly laundry adventures." I took his number and smiled, shaking my head. "Deal. But only if you promise not to insult Pride and Prejudice again." We laughed, and as I watched him walk away, I realized that sometimes the best connections happen in the most unexpected places. I was standing in line at the pharmacy, zoning out while waiting for my prescription, when I saw her. She was a middle-aged woman with a kind face, wearing a faded cardigan and holding a cane, her movements deliberate, as if every step was a small victory. I didn't know her, yet something about her seemed familiar. After a moment, she caught my eye and gave a slight, knowing smile, the kind you offer someone you think you recognize. It hit me then. I did recognize her, but it wasn't from work or a class or anywhere I could logically explain. I knew her from a memory, the one that didn't seem entirely mine. When I finally picked up my prescription, I felt an odd urge to talk to her. Normally, I wouldn't initiate conversation with a stranger like that, but I found myself pausing by the exit. "Hey," I said awkwardly, trying to ignore how strange I felt. "Do we know each other from somewhere?" She looked at me, and for a moment I thought I'd made a mistake. But then she smiled, a touch of amusement dancing in her eyes. "Oh, maybe," she said gently, "or maybe I just remind you of someone. People have funny ways of being connected." She extended her hand, as if introducing herself was the most natural thing in the world. "I'm Eleanor. Do you come to this pharmacy often?" I couldn't help but smile at how odd and yet familiar this whole exchange felt. I shook her hand. "Yeah, once a month or so. I'm Claire." Her eyes flickered with something, a hint of surprise, maybe. She nodded, looking me over as if she were assessing something. And then she asked, "Do you believe in connections across lives?" I laughed nervously. "You mean like reincarnation?" "Not exactly," she said. "I mean those moments when you meet someone and it feels like you've known them a lifetime, when it defies logic, but somehow you just remember them." I felt my breath hitch. I'd felt that a few times in my life, usually with strangers in passing. I chalked it up to coincidence, but something in the way she spoke made me question that. I nodded slowly, not quite trusting myself to speak. She looked at me closely, as if she were searching for something she thought she'd lost. "Would you like to join me for coffee?" A strange pull drew me to agree, and within a few minutes, we found ourselves in a quiet corner booth of the coffee shop across the street. As I sat down, I felt the surreal sensation of déjà vu, like I'd been in this exact spot with her before, though I knew it wasn't possible. I stirred my coffee, glancing up at her, and finally asked, "Why did you ask me here?" Eleanor took a sip of her tea, studying me with an intensity that felt out of place for a stranger. "Because," she said softly, "I think I've met you before, though I can't remember when." The words landed heavily between us. I didn't know what to say, but something about the way she looked at me made me believe her. It was as if she was carefully peeling back layers, hoping to uncover something just beyond reach. "You're probably going to think I'm crazy," she said after a long pause, "but I've had this feeling about you, even before I saw you at the pharmacy today. It's like a memory I can't quite put my finger on, but when I saw you, I just knew." I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. "What do you think it means?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes I wonder if we cross paths with certain people over and over again, like ripples intersecting in a pond. Maybe we're meant to find each other every so often, for reasons we don't fully understand." I let her words sink in. I'd always been a logical person, someone who craved explanations and neat answers. Yet here I was, drawn to this conversation in a way I couldn't explain. I thought of a few people in my life who'd felt like instant connections. People I'd met briefly, but remembered for years, and wondered if that's what Eleanor was talking about. Then she surprised me by reaching in her bag and pulling out a worn, dog-eared photo. She handed it to me without a word. It was a black and white picture, and it looked like it was taken in the late 40s or early 50s. Two young women stood by a river, arms slung around each other, laughing at something beyond the frame. One of them looked strikingly familiar. "Is that?" I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. She nodded. "That's me when I was 20, and the woman beside me was my best friend, Alice. We were inseparable, like sisters, though we'd only known each other for a few months. She was kind, headstrong, fiercely protective. Her eyes softened, her gaze lingering on the image. She died in an accident not long after this was taken." I felt a pang in my chest, a strange, unexpected sorrow as I looked at the photo. There was something hauntingly familiar about it, as if I'd seen it before or even been there. I shook my head, blinking back the sensation. "Why are you showing this to me?" "Because, Claire," she took a deep breath, looking at me with a mixture of hope and sadness. "You look exactly like her." The air went still. I didn't know what to say, but I felt the weight of her words pressing down on me, as if she'd opened a door into some other version of myself I didn't even know existed. I looked down at the photo again, my hands trembling slightly, and found myself wondering if she was right. "Do you believe we meet people for reasons?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm starting to," I replied, barely able to look at her. There was a strange comfort in her presence, a feeling that I'd finally found something I hadn't even known I was missing. We sat there in silence for a long time, each of us lost in our own thoughts, yet somehow connected in a way that transcended words. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, a truth that was just beyond reach, but that I'd glimpsed, if only for a moment. When we finally parted ways, I hugged her, and she held me tightly, as if afraid to let go. As I walked away, I felt an odd sense of loss, as though I were leaving behind a part of myself. I didn't look back, but I could feel her watching me, her presence lingering like an old melody I couldn't quite remember. Since that day, I've carried the photo with me, tucked away in my wallet. I don't know why, but it feels important, like a piece of a puzzle I might someday understand. Every so often, I take it out and look at it, wondering about Alice, about the connection Eleanor believed in, and about the strange, beautiful mystery of life and all the souls we meet along the way. Maybe one day, I'll run into Eleanor again. Or maybe I won't. But that meeting changed something in me, a quiet shift that I can't explain. It left me with a question that I'm still pondering, an open-ended invitation to explore the parts of life that don't fit neatly into explanations or reason. And strangely, I feel at peace with him. He was the kind of friend you don't see coming. We met in a college statistics class. Both of us hopelessly lost, exchanging desperate glances across the classroom. I don't even remember who approached who first, but by the end of that semester, we were thick as thieves, studying together, sharing endless cups of bad coffee, laughing until we cried over the silliest things. He was brilliant, charmingly sarcastic, and surprisingly compassionate, the kind of friend who'd listen to you vent at 2 a.m. without a hint of judgment. Somewhere along the line, he became my person, my confidant, my closest friend. Neither of us would admit to it, but there was an undercurrent, a spark that both of us ignored with impressive determination. We'd hug a second too long, laugh a little too loud at each other's jokes, but always maintain that we were just friends. I'd even introduce him to people that way, rolling my eyes at anyone who dared to suggest otherwise. I thought I had it all under control until one late night changed everything. We'd gone out with some mutual friends, had a few drinks, and by the time we got back to my place, we were tipsy, giddy, and in that warm haze where everything feels possible. He plopped down on the couch, stretched out, and patted the seat next to him, grinning. "Come on, don't be shy." I laughed, kicking off my shoes and sitting down beside him. 1 minute, we were cracking up over some ridiculous memory, and the next, he was looking at me in a way he never had before. I remember every second of that silence. We both just stared at each other, as if daring the other person to make the first move. And then we were kissing, and it was like everything I'd ever tried to bury just burst out, too powerful to ignore. It was intense, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice was warning me that this could ruin everything. But in that moment, I didn't care. The next morning, reality hit hard. I woke up to the sound of him quietly getting dressed, trying not to wake me. He flashed me an awkward smile when he realized I was awake, but neither of us knew what to say. Eventually, he mumbled something about needing to leave, and just like that, he was gone. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it didn't mean anything, that we'd laugh it off and go back to normal. But deep down, I knew better. The weeks that followed were a mess of mixed signals and stilted conversations. We both acted like nothing had changed, but every interaction felt charged, weighted by the memory of that night. We'd go from joking around like before to these sudden, awkward silences, and I found myself analyzing every look, every touch, wondering if he was feeling the same confusion I was. Then, out of nowhere, he introduced me to his new girlfriend. I stood there, plastering on a smile, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. She was sweet, pretty, and perfect for him. I convinced myself that I should be happy for him, that he deserved someone who wasn't overanalyzing every little thing. We still hung out, of course, but it was different. He'd bring her along sometimes, and every time I saw them together, it was like a little piece of me chipped away. One night, after way too many drinks, I finally broke. We were out with the group, and he'd left his girlfriend at home. Somewhere between my third and fourth drink, I pulled him aside, half laughing, half crying, asking why things had to change. "We could have just been friends," I said, my voice breaking. He looked at me, his face torn between confusion and something else I couldn't quite place. "I didn't know you felt this way," he said quietly, a mix of regret and surprise in his voice. I felt my face flush, suddenly wishing I'd kept my mouth shut, but there was no going back. We stood there, both of us too afraid to say anything else, and the moment passed. I watched him walk back to the group, and I knew then that whatever we'd had was over, even if we couldn't name what it was. After that, I distanced myself. I made excuses, pretended to be too busy, did whatever I could to avoid him. It was painful, but it was the only way I could cope. He noticed, of course, and he tried reaching out, but eventually he stopped. I told myself it was for the best, that we'd been foolish to think we could be more than friends without ruining everything. Months went by, and life moved on. I graduated, got a job in a new city, and tried to let go of the what-ifs. Every now and then, I'd think of him, wondering if he ever looked back on that night and felt the same pang of regret. But I buried those thoughts, convinced that some things are just meant to be left in the past. Then, years later, I ran into him at a mutual friend's wedding. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked older, more polished, but still unmistakably him. We locked eyes from across the room, and before I knew it, he was walking over, a familiar smile on his face. We made small talk, laughed about old memories, but there was a new tension between us, something we both felt but didn't dare to name. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd thinned out, he asked if I wanted to take a walk. We ended up wandering around the empty streets, just talking like we used to. He looked at me, his voice quiet, and said, "I've always regretted that night." I felt my heart race, every buried feeling surging to the surface. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I asked, barely able to breathe. He shook his head, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. I was scared I'd ruined the best thing I had. I don't know who moved first, but suddenly we were kissing, a kiss years in the making, filled with every word left unsaid. It was bittersweet, knowing all the time we'd lost, but in that moment, none of it mattered. We stood there, holding each other, as if letting go would mean losing everything all over again. We didn't have all the answers, and we didn't need them. For the first time, it felt like we were finally right where we were supposed to be. The message arrived on a gray afternoon in January, popping up on my phone as I sat at my desk, halfway through a report I'd been rewriting for hours. It was from Mom. "Come home if you can. Your father isn't doing well." There were no details, no explanation, but I didn't need one. Dad had been fighting his illness for years, and every time I visited, it felt like watching him slip further away, piece by piece. My hands felt numb as I typed out a quick reply, booked a flight, and emailed my boss. Within hours, I was at the airport, shuffling through security in a daze. The drive from the airport to my parents' house was long and silent. The town looked the same, snow-covered lawns, Christmas lights still hanging on porches, as if everyone was reluctant to let the holiday warmth go. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had, but somehow smaller, as though the years had hunched its shoulders too. Mom met me at the door, her face pale and lined with worry, the same tired smile she always wore when she was trying to be strong. She hugged me, quick and tight, before stepping back. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," I murmured, though my voice sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. "How's he doing?" Her eyes softened. "He's resting now. It's been a tough few days." We stood in silence, the weight of everything hanging between us, too heavy for words. I followed her into the living room, and there he was, lying in his armchair, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and shallow. He looked smaller, frilier, his skin pale and papery, like he was fading away. I took a deep breath and sat down beside him, feeling the quietness settle around us, heavy and still. Dad opened his eyes when he felt me there, his gaze meeting mine with a faint glimmer of recognition. He gave me a weak smile, his hand lifting just enough to rest on mine. "Hey, kiddo," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, Dad." We sat there, hand in hand, as the light outside dimmed. The silence felt almost comforting, like an old friend settling in. For the first time in years, I felt the urge to stay still, to let go of all the words that felt stuck in my throat. This was Dad's way. No long speeches, no big emotions, just quiet, steady presence. And in that moment, I felt closer to him than I had in a long time. The next few days blurred together in a series of small moments. Sitting by his bedside, helping Mom with meals, holding his hand whenever he woke up. There was a strange intimacy in those moments, a fragile kind of peace that I hadn't expected. Sometimes he would smile at me, a faint, tired smile, and I'd feel a warmth that reminded me of all the times he'd been there, quiet and steady, the one constant in a world that always seemed to be spinning too fast. One night, as I was helping Mom clean up after dinner, she looked at me with that same tired smile. "I know it hasn't been easy for you," she said quietly, "but he's so glad you're here." "We both are." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "I wish I'd come sooner," I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I kept thinking there would be more time. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "We all think that, don't we?" We finished cleaning up in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. That night, as I sat by Dad's bedside, he reached out, his fingers brushing mine. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and shallow, but there was a peace in his face that made my chest ache. I held his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, and I whispered the words I'd never been able to say. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." I didn't know if he heard me, but I hoped he did. I hoped he knew how much he meant to me, even if I'd never found the words to tell him. In the early hours of the morning, he slipped away as quietly as he had lived, his hand still in mine, his face peaceful. Mom and I sat there, holding each other, as the dawn crept over the horizon, filling the room with a soft, gentle light. In the days that followed, we took turns packing up his things, each object a memory, a fragment of the life he'd built with us. His old books, his tools, his worn leather jacket that smelled faintly of aftershave. I found myself wandering through the house, touching everything as if to hold on to him a little longer. On my last night before leaving, I found a small box tucked away in the corner of his closet. Inside was a collection of old letters, each one written in his neat, careful handwriting. They were addressed to me, dated years apart, each one a quiet testament to the love he'd never spoken out loud. The first one was from when I was born, a short, simple note about how proud he was, how he'd waited so long for this moment. I sat on the floor, reading through each letter, feeling his presence beside me with every word. He'd written about my first steps, my first day of school, the time I'd broken my arm climbing a tree. He'd written about all the moments we'd shared, the things he'd never said out loud, but had carried with him all these years. The last letter was dated just a few weeks before he'd gotten sick. It was short, barely a few lines, but it held a weight that felt almost too much to bear. "I'm so proud of you. I may not say it often, but I hope you know." I folded the letter, my hands trembling, and slipped it into my pocket. I knew I'd keep it with me, a small piece of him to carry forward. As I left the house the next morning, I looked back one last time, taking in every detail. The cracked steps, the peeling paint, the quiet, familiar shape of home. It felt strange to leave, knowing he wouldn't be there when I returned. But I also felt a quiet strength, a sense of peace I hadn't expected. He was gone, but he wasn't really. He was there, in the memories, in the love he'd left behind, in the letters I carried with me. I drove away, the road stretching out before me, long and empty. The world felt different, quieter somehow, like a chapter closing. But as I reached into my pocket, feeling the crinkle of his last letter, I knew that a part of him would always be with me, a quiet presence guiding me forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.